All right, all right. We should be live. Let me make sure everything's up and running. I think we're live and we are connected. Welcome in everybody. Thanks for being here. If you caught me on AXP, welcome in if you're your first time seeing me. And for those who joined, we had a bunch of people join the Kraken Crew Elite here while we were waiting. We had Teeter Meter join the Kraken Crew Elite, big W. Everyone who's in the Kraken Crew Elite, of course, you guys already know, has access to the Deconstruction cheat sheet. I added a new spot on the Deconstruction cheat sheet this weekend. If you go to the tab for the Apocrypha, there's a link to a document that I created this weekend that's got all of the usages of the apocryphal texts by the early church fathers up to the first 400 years. So if you wanted to discuss and learn about what the early church thought about the apocrypha and how they used it, that's going to be the place you want to go. So definitely check out the new section on the cheat sheet. I'll add more to it this week, of course, on another tab. I'm working on doing a cross-reference of all the laws of Moses with the laws of the rest of the ancient Near East, and I'm getting pretty close to finish with it. Jesse, welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite. And Fen, thank you for joining the Kraken Crew, big W. And Brett Hayes, welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite as well. Also, QW joined the Kraken Crew Elite. Also, guys, I added this weekend 2 new emojis for members. I got around to adding the Hebrew hymen emoji because, listen, there was a request, all right, to get the Hebrew hymen emoji in there. So I added it. And then I also added today, I made a dodgeball. I made a dodgeball emoji for the dip, dive, dodge, dip, duck, so on and so forth, and whatnot. So we got a dodgeball emoji too. Aiden, welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite, big W, Aiden. And thank you so much for the $5 super thanks, Amir. I appreciate it. Amir says, keep it up. Well, I say I will keep it up as much as humanly possible. I appreciate the support. And we've got a member, Master Machetier, for 3 months. Master, thank you so much for being a member. I think we've only had memberships open for 3 months. So you must have signed up at the very beginning. So thank you for being a 3-month subscriber. It says, do they reject evolution because it does away with original sin narrative? There was death before Eden. Hundreds of millions of years animals were. Okay, so this is a really good question because my understanding of the Christian problem with evolution is that it nullifies the whole Adam story. It ruins everything, and they're trying. So, for example, I took a course on Genesis once just as an elective. It was actually after I graduated. I was just looking through some of the courses because after you graduate, a lot of times your school will let you take more courses for free, just like a couple a year, because you're a valued alumni. So I took a course on Genesis, and it was really interesting. Some of the apologetics that were happening, trying to integrate evolution with the Adam narrative. And there's just not a really good way to do it. At some point, you have to admit that humans were on the earth longer than 6,000 years. And if you want to get around that, you have to do crazy things, like say perhaps that it's a metaphor. It didn't really happen that way. Somehow it's a metaphor, but once you make it into a metaphor, it loses all meaning. And it also betrays the fact that the New Testament thinks that it really happened. But Carlos, thank you so much for the 100 MX. I don't know what currency that is, but big W, Carlos Valdez. I appreciate that. So yeah, guys, thank you so much for the support. Let's see some questions. I got some people already that threw up some of the new dodgeball emotes and there we go. We've got the dodgeball emotes. And unfortunately, the emote for the Hebrew hymen's hard to see, but maybe it's better that way because it's going to get me banned. It's going to happen. It's just all there is to it. It's going to get me banned eventually. But listen, people wanted it, so we made it happen. You know what I mean? All right, let me get my screen back up. Also, another member to the Kraken Crew Elite. Welcome in That God Fucks. Amazing name, by the way. And it depends on which God you're talking about, because if you're talking about the God in Mormonism, or the gods in Mormonism, those gods do, that's how all the gods were made. There was a supreme God who had like endless celestial intercourse with another God, and made all these gods. That's just how they came to be. So yeah, that's a real thing. All right, let me grab our next super chat. Looks like a question. This comes from Adele Reader. Adele, thank you so much for the $20 super chat. That's very generous. I appreciate that. It says, "Hi, Justin. I have my teenage daughter tonight. We've talked about you so much that she's interested to watch with us and ask questions. I think she has low-key started deconstructing her friends. Thanks for all you do." Well, I really appreciate letting me know, Adele. And I think it's hard not to. Like once you see how the sausage is made, and then you see other people eating the sausage, it's hard not to open your mouth and be like, "But did you see the shit that they did to that sausage?" I've got a young niece, very, very sharp. I think she's 22 or 23 now. She graduated recently, but she's atheist. One of the few atheists in my family. But like, she's seen too much already. Like she knows the issue. She went to a school, and they must have talked about these issues while she was there at school. And now that she's seen it, she can't unsee it. And so she doesn't believe, even though she's from a family where pretty much everybody does believe. Everybody in my family believes. So it's just true. Once you see the problems with the text, you can't unsee them. And that's why, personally, for me, my tactic for deconstruction is always, let's read the text. Let's see what is in the text. Because once somebody lays their eyes on the text and they see the horrific issues with the text, they can't unsee them. They already saw it. The ship has already sailed. It's already done. But thank you so much for the super chat, Adele. And thank you for letting me know. Keep me up to date on your journey and your family's journey. I'd be curious to know how things turn out. And Amir gifting out a Deconstruction Zone membership. Thank you so much, Amir. I really appreciate that. We've got a question in from Mostly Gizzards. Mostly Gizzards, great to see you tonight, friend. Thank you so much for the super chat. It says, topic, whether you can choose to believe. Oh, I love this topic. It says, trying to think about parallels and responses. When someone is delusional and believes that a celebrity loves them, what would we tell them? I'd say they're delusional without proof. So this is a really good question. Here's what I know. Okay, so I worked with a guy. I'm not going to name names, but I work currently with a guy who nearly fell into one of the scams where he thought that he was receiving messages from a very attractive woman who was also famous that we would all know. I forget which one of the actresses it was. It was a famous actress. Now, here's the thing. It took a team of us over the course of like 2 weeks to convince him that he was about to be scammed. And that's how hard the delusion is, right? So when somebody is in a delusion, you're right. They're just in a delusion. There's no way around it, right? But the problem is when somebody is in a delusion, I think they need something tangible to grab onto. They need a piece of reality to hold on to bring them out of the delusion, even if it's clear to everybody else that they're just delusional. To the person who is delusional, it's nearly impossible to know that you are in delusion. In fact, a good friend of mine who used to be active on TikTok is not so active anymore, but he invented the whole skit for the space, not Space Jesus. It's the Space Jesus skit. There's a better word for it. I'm missing a word, but some of you know about the Space Jesus skits that were popular. on TikTok probably about 2 years ago. But anyways, he actually has a condition he has to take medication for where he goes through bouts of what would be called psychosis, where his mental state disconnects from reality, right? And so and he didn't know it, right? You need other people to come in and ground you when you're in these particular states because you don't know that you're in the states, right? So anyways, to your question, it says, when someone is delusional and believes that a celebrity loves them, what would we tell them? You could just say you're delusional. That's one way to do it, and it would be true. I don't know if it would be the most effective means. To me, that's my personal opinion. I think the better you can take them out of their delusion and ground it in something tangible, the more likely they are to accept the idea that maybe they are being delusional. It's kind of like my brother told me something really good once, a long time ago. He said, Justin, if you can't just let somebody get you down if they say something bad about you. Like if somebody calls you an asshole, you can't take it personally. He goes, but if everybody thinks you're an asshole, maybe you're an asshole. And I think that was really good because it opens the door to think like it lets your foot in to the idea of, hey, maybe there is a way that I'm seeing things that other people aren't seeing things. And I think that's the core typically of this discussion is how can I allow this person to see what everyone else can see, but they can't see. So hope that answers the question, Gizzard. Noah, lions ate dead babies on the ark. Good to see you, friend, tonight. Thank you so much for the super chat. It says, I'm a believer in the Bible now. Oh, no. Oh, no. Don't say that. It says, finally found something that's helpful. Now praying for our government leaders. Let us start with Psalm 109:7. Shit, I actually forgot Psalm 109. Now I've got to go and look it up because I know this is going to be a joke, but because I certainly don't believe that you deconverted on me. Psalm 109:7 says, when he is tried, let him be found guilty. Let his prayer be counted as sin. Yeah, you're right. This is for our government leaders. This is truly the word of Doug. Let his accuser stand on his right. I agree with this. May his children be orphans. This is an amazing passage. Good get. Really good get, Noah's Lions. I really appreciate that one. I can always count on you for a little bit of humor and some bringing some what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the hard-nosed takes that only a nurse could provide. But thank you so much, Fierce Interaction, for the $10 super chat. Fierce says, this live stream had me believing hymen discussions were commonplace. Now I have a meeting with HR. Nice seeing you twice in one day. Fierce, I'm so sorry, but listen. The hymen discussion on Deuteronomy 22, it's hard for it to end because one of two things is going to happen. The believer is going to eventually be backed into a corner where they have to admit that it's a horrific text. Or the opposite of that is they can argue and say, well, it doesn't actually say the stuff that you said it said. And here's how I'm going to change all those words. And that turns into a lengthy discussion. But hey, thanks for tuning in and watching on AXP and also on the Unapologetic. We had quite a day today. Been a hell of a Sunday, pun intended. And Dedicated, welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite. You have access to the cheat sheet now. And Acme Hero, thank you so much for the super chat. Good to hear from you, friend. Acme says, great job on AXP, Justin. Genesis is the first sci-fi story. Alien being seeds Earth with hominid and then clones it. Humans, a failed experiment. Actually, that's a good point. That's a good point. So if humans weren't created by God, but was still created by some kind of an outside force, like we were an experiment, is the experiment going well? I would say no. Like if somebody created us in a sandbox as an experimental species of life somehow, and they're asking themselves if things are going well, I don't think things are going very well. Like could you imagine if you created an ant farm and then like the ants just spent all their time inventing new ways of destroying each other rather than building the colony? No, not at all. Listen, ants are the most like highly organized organisms in the planet. If you look at what they do, like hell, ants can even solve like complex geometrical problems. And they, as far as I can tell, they got a lot less violence than what you get in Christianity. So maybe it's time to introduce an ant god to the equation. Thank you for the question, though. Wolven Joker, thank you so much for the $20 super chat. Big W for the super chat says, that their background says no debate. What do you mean by that? Define debate. Define no. I think your channel is contingent on debate. God damn it, getting Philbroed on my own channel, not even a debate. It says, I believe my debate is objectively good. Praise Lincoln, Huxley, and Churchill. Well, listen, your comment is objectively good, and it's subjectively funny. At least it was to me. I would even go as far to say that it should be objectively funny. But really fantastic use of words there. I really appreciate that. And you're almost correct. My channel is somewhat contingent on debates, which reminds me, here's what I'm trying to do in 2025 with my channel. I've had a lot of people that want me to produce more educational content. So, and as you guys already know, my channel is mostly debate content. I'm going to keep debating on my channel, of course, but I'm slowly moving my debate clips over to a new channel called DZ Debates, and I'll explain why I'm doing this here in a second. So here's the actual channel. It's a DZ Debates. It's just at DZ Debates. So my hope here in 2025 is to move a lot of the debate content to that channel other than the live streams. That way it doesn't clog up my channel with just debate clips, because I want to start doing more educational content. I have a lot of people request to do educational videos on various topics and things like that, and I want to be able to do that. And what I don't want to do is to have that valuable educational content completely drowned out by debate content. So I'm going to have, by the end of the year, I'm going to be doing a lot of my debate clips on DZ Debates. So if you just want the debates, if you just want debate clips, then DZ Debates will have those debate clips. If you want more of the educational content, then you'll want to follow my main channel. Of course, you can follow both, obviously. But anyways, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate that. And Pimpin', big W for the $49.99 super chat. Big W. I appreciate that, Pimpin'. Actually, you might be a real pimp. If you're out here sending $49 super chats, we really appreciate that. I can only assume that you walk around with a felt hat with a feather in it. So big W. It says, you've been a big help in me getting over the issue I had while deconstructing. Can you give me a rundown on what to say to my Christian friend who thinks we are in the end times because of Euphrates River and Leviathan supposedly being seen? Okay, that's actually a really good question. So this is what I would do. Okay, I'm going to take you to Revelation chapter 16. If you go to Revelation chapter 16, we hear about these bowls of wrath, the one including the Euphrates River. First of all, just right out the gate, recall that the Euphrates River has not dried up. So first of all, it just hasn't. That's factually speaking, it hasn't dried up yet. That being said, even if it did, it's kind of irrelevant. Look at the context of the Euphrates River drying up, and look what it says in the text, right? It says, the first angel went and poured his bowl on the earth, and a foul and painful sore came on those who had the brand of the beast and who worshipped his image. So first of all, there's a chronology of events here, and the chronology starts with angel number 1 pouring out the bowl of wrath. In fact, everyone who has the mark of the beast is going to have this grievous sore. In fact, I think this is, what translation? Okay. So that didn't happen. So we know the rest of this chapter didn't happen either. But the second plague, right? It says, a second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, and it became like the blood of a corpse, and every living thing in the sea died. Well, that never happened either. So again, we've got another chronological event that didn't happen. Number 3, a third angel poured out his bowl. Also, by the way, let me know if this pissed anyone else off as well. The fact that whoever was it Langton that did the verse numbering for English, that they didn't use actual verse numbers that corresponded with the order of events drives me insane. That the first angel is verse number 2, the second angel is verse number 3. There's 100 ways they could have figured it out so that they had the verse number match the number of the angel, and they couldn't be bothered with it. Anyways, that's just a personal gripe. So the third angel pours out a bowl onto the rivers and the springs of water, and they become blood. That never happened. The fourth angel poured out the bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. Never happened. And then we get to the fifth angel, poured his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom was plunged into darkness. Never happened. So all of these things are preceding the Euphrates River drying in bowl number 6. It says the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up in order to prepare the way for the kings of the east. So it wasn't dried up. In fact, and here's the other thing, the prophecy is a bit irrelevant because it says that the river dried up to make way for the kings of the east. The way the prophecy is given is it's given with the idea that the river needs to dry up for the army to pass over it, which means it has no idea of what's happening in our time period. No idea whatsoever. It has no idea that in modern times, we wouldn't need a river to dry up for an army to cross over it. It's an unnecessary component. Yet, that's what we find in the Bible, because the Bible is hopelessly stuck using details from the time period in which it was written because it couldn't actually predict the future. As for the Leviathan, there's no such thing as a Leviathan. The Leviathan is a mythological creature that, remember, already is dead. Right? So according to Psalm 74 and others, Rahab, also called the Leviathan, was already killed by Yahweh. He split the heads of the Leviathan. It's already dead. So the fact that there's a Leviathan that shows up in the book of Revelation must mean that it's a metaphor for something, not that it's a real Leviathan. It's not a real watery serpent. It's a metaphor for something else, just like the beasts are metaphors for people. So the fact that somebody saw a watery serpent doesn't have anything to do with the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation already understands that the Leviathan is a reference to probably a human being and not a reference to the primordial sea serpent that the God of the Old Testament already executed. Anyways, I hope that answers your question, Pimpin. I appreciate the super chat. Those are actually really good questions. And I get it. If you're really unfamiliar with the Bible, making these claims about these prophecies coming true, they can sound persuasive, but unfortunately, if you know your Bible, they're not persuasive. The governor, thank you for the super chat, says, have you seen Bill Craig's nonsense book about Adam and Eve? Actually, I've not seen Bill Craig's, you mean William Lane Craig? Or I assume you're calling him Bill as a derogatory method. Let me see if it's William Lane Craig, Adam and Eve. Let's see what it says. In Quest of the Historical Adam. That's the name of it, by William Lane Craig. I didn't know he put out that book in 2021. I haven't read it. I'd be curious to read it myself. My guess is it's going to be a bunch of nonsensical pseudoscientific drivel comparable to his bad philosophy, if I had to guess. That being said, I mean, I kind of like William Lane Craig. I don't pick on him all that much because he's kind of a nice guy. He's wrong, but I think he's a nice guy. I prefer to pick on the apologists that are more pricks. But I think William Lane Craig means well. I just don't agree with his opinion. But no, I haven't read the book. I'm gonna have to check it out now. Thanks for letting me know. Welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite, Ben Jovi. Good name, by the way. And also welcome into the Kraken Crew, Bad Religion, new member. Thank you for joining. And we've got a super chat question from Mostly Gizzards. Thank you so much for the super chat, Gizzards. He says, follow up. When a Christian tells us we can choose to believe, how different is that from choosing delusion? Oh, that's a good question. Okay. First of all, there's no difference. But second of all, you can't choose to believe. So here's what I typically will challenge people to do when they say, well, you can choose to believe. I would say something like this. Can you, if it's a guy, I would say, can you choose to be sexually attracted to me? Can you choose to be aroused to me? Now, 99% of the time, that guy is going to say, no, I can't because I'm not attracted to men. I would say, yes, but you can choose to be attracted to me. The reality is they can't. They know they can't. So I think that's a good way to kind of go about that particular discussion and recognize that there's a lot of things that they can't choose to believe. So, for example, you can say, can you choose to believe right now that everybody on earth is dead? Well, they might say yes, but the reality is if you ask them to do it, they can't do it. Because if they did truly believe that everybody on earth was dead, they would go into an immediate panic. If you really believed that you're the last person alive, that nobody on the earth is alive, you would go into the most existential crisis ever imagined. Nobody can do it, and they can't demonstrate that they can do it without lying to themselves and to the people watching. So that's what I would do. I would ask them to force themselves to believe things that we know that they can't force themselves to believe, just to demonstrate that this idea of choosing to believe isn't a real thing. Like, you're either convinced by something or you're not convinced by it. And listen, if I was convinced by the God hypothesis, I would be a theist, but I'm not convinced. So anyways, thank you so much for the super chat, though. It's a good follow-up question. I appreciate that, Gizzard. We got a question coming in from Godwin. It says, what are your thoughts on Jesus saying Noah's Ark and Cain and Abel are real? Okay, so I love this point, by the way, Godwin. So a lot of people will say things like, well, these parts of the Old Testament aren't literally true. In fact, I had a professor in Bible college that would say, like, Genesis isn't, it's not a historical book or a science book. It's a theological book, right? There's a theological truth to it. And that's adorable that you think that, because the New Testament doesn't treat it like a theological book. The New Testament treats it like it's physically written by Moses, telling literal truths. The genealogy of Jesus goes all the way back to Adam, indicating that they thought these were all real people. Jesus himself says about his second coming that it's going to be like the days of Noah. In fact, he says this in the book of Matthew. He says that people will be eating and drinking just like in the days of Noah, and that it'll come like the flood in a flash with no one even knowing what was happening. So this idea that Jesus is looking back and saying that these are real events is a bit problematic, because it makes it so you can no longer go into Genesis and say, oh, these are just stories, because Jesus didn't think that they were just stories. And even further than that, the New Testament references the destruction of Sodom. Jesus says of Tyre and Sidon when he preaches there, he says, was it Tyre and Sidon? Now I forget. Anyways, he at one point he says it will, for those who are rejecting Jesus' message, he says it will be worse for you than what does he say? He says it'll be worse for you than for Tyre and Sidon, because even if the works had been done among those of Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented long ago. Now I actually got to look up the quote, because I know I'm misquoting it, but let me make sure we get it right. But Jesus references the destruction of Sodom in the book of Matthew in a way which would lead one to believe that he thought it was a real telling of events. Yeah, Matthew chapter, what chapter? Matthew chapter 10, verse 15. in this is he sent out the 12, blah, 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 blah. Yep. He tells them not to take any gold, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he says, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave the house of that town. And it says, truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. And he says something very similar when he's preaching to the northern territory as well. In Matthew 11. So the very next chapter, Matthew 11, verse 23 and 24. He says, I tell you, on the day of judgment, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Hades. For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. So Jesus is under the opinion that Sodom and Gomorrah were legitimately destroyed the way Genesis told the story. And so if you believe that Jesus is saying true things, you have to accept a literal interpretation of these Old Testament books, because Jesus thought that they were there. So good question though. Renaissance Media, thank you for the super chat. Big W says, have you heard of liberation theology? What are your thoughts? So I'm vaguely familiar with liberation theology. It's kind of in the same vein sometimes as process theology, which is like there are various brands of open theism. But the thing that separates liberation theology from like open theism and process theology is in liberation theology, there's this idea that nobody is free until everybody is free, right? So there's this idea that like God is working through mankind to bring about the liberation of all people. And that is the end goal. And then the kingdom of God will be here on earth. But that's kind of the idea of liberation theology. It's a theology of theoretical liberation of the oppressed. Like we bring the kingdom of God about. We bring the kingdom of God here by liberating all forms of oppression. And so you can see why like liberation theology was very popular among African-American churches. In fact, Reverend Wright, he was a famous pastor, famous reverend who was really into liberation theology. In fact, that was the pastor, if I remember correctly, of the church that Obama went to. And Obama actually was part of the liberation theology movement. So that's kind of the situation with liberation theology. It's not a terrible way to read the New Testament if you take the Gospel of Luke seriously. Luke seems to be, of all the Gospels, Luke seems to be the Gospel that you could use to justify a liberation theology. But I don't think you find it in the writings of Paul. I don't really think you find it that much in like some of the other books, like for example, in the book of Hebrews, certainly not in the book of Revelation, and especially not in Thessalonians from Paul. In Paul's book of Thessalonians, there's no, like the kingdom of God is going to come like a thief in the night, and the dead are going to be raised from the dust of the earth. Like it's like a second coming type of theology, not a liberation theology. But there are ways to marry Paul with liberation theology. I just haven't seen a lot of attempts to do it, but definitely check out, if you like liberation theology, definitely check out, I think it was Max Whitehead, who kind of pioneered process theology. Process theology wasn't as popular, but I think if you're studying that form of theology, I would definitely dip your toes in process theology and read a little bit on open theism. But Alan, thank you so much for the $10 super chat. I appreciate the super chat. Alan says, love your stuff, man. Keep it up. Well, Alan, thank you so much. I really appreciate the support. I'm going to keep doing my thing. My goal is to help people deconstruct and get through the mess of religion. And I'm having a good time doing it. And I really appreciate that so many people are supporting my work. And I want to be able to put my education to good use. I went through all that schooling, and I think I have I think I have an opinion that is valid until someone can prove me wrong. You know what I mean? But Noah, again, thank you so much, Noah, for the super chat. It says, keep reading, especially the context of Trump. Yeah, actually, so in Psalm 109, which we were reading earlier, it matches Trump so well. In fact, there's a bunch of passages in the Psalms where they're basically wishing horrendous stuff on their enemies, and Psalm 109 is one of those. In fact, it's such a good point, because if you get down to verse 11 and 12, right? Let's start in 10. It says, may his children wander about and beg. May they be driven out of the ruins they inhabit. May the creditor seize all he has. May strangers plunder the fruits of his toil. May there be no one to do him kindness, nor anyone to pity his orphan children. May his posterity be cut off, and may his name be blotted out in the second generation. May the iniquity of his father be remembered before the Lord. So, listen, if there was ever a passage in the Bible that pointed to Trump, it's definitely Psalm 109. Listen, if you're going to pray anything from the Bible over our current leadership, pray Psalm 109 and get some prayer answered. We need it right now, guys. Christians, if you're in here and you're praying, pray Psalm 109 over our leadership, please. Thank you so much for that super chat. And we've got, give me a second. We've got a bunch of super chats. Let me get them loaded up here. I apologize if we're getting backed up. There's one I can't show from Euphemisms. It says message was retracted. I don't know what happened there, but thank you so much for the $20 super chat. I really appreciate that, even though we can't see your message, but thank you so much. And Rob, thank you so much for the 665, one short of the Antichrist of Nero, but thank you so much. It says great. Thank you for all the great content. Well, thank you for the support, and I'm going to keep the content coming for sure. And Helium Biscuits, hell of a name. I like that. Thank you for the super chat. It says, hello, Justin. You and Doug rule. What does the Hebrew mean by go into her, as it is a graphic and gross as it is it as graphic and gross as it sounds? Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 25. Yeah, so Deuteronomy 21 verses 10 through 17-ish talk about what to do with a woman captured in war, and talks about how you can go into her. And here's the thing. It is as graphic as it sounds. Now, in English, we would just say, you know, to consummate the marriage if we wanted to be prudish, right? We could say have sex, and everyone knows what that means. But in like polite society, we want to soften that language. So we would say like consummate the marriage rather than having sex. We find the same thing in the Hebrew scriptures. They always want to say stuff about genitalia without really mentioning the genitalia, because they were prudes too. That's like when it talks about Eleazar making a pledge for Abraham. It says Eleazar put his hand under the thigh of Abraham. It wasn't his friggin' thigh. He was cupping the dude's ball sack. He was making a pledge about the seed of Abraham, and he put his hand on the thing containing the seeds as he was making the pledge. You typically put your hand on the stuff you're making the pledge about. It was a symbolic sign. So yeah, it was like their prudish way of saying the things without saying the things. Like in Numbers 5, when it talks about the woman who drinks the potion to determine if she committed adultery, it says her thighs will fall away. Well, it's not referring to her thighs. Her thighs aren't falling away. It's referring to her genitalia falling away, specifically the reproductive genitalia, the uterus. It's talking about how she's going to be made to miscarriage. But they had all these ways of saying the dirty stuff without saying the dirty stuff, and that was just one of them. But great question. Yeah, when you see in the Bible where it talks about going into a woman, it's, you know, going in. That's what he's talking about. Going right in. Abraham the Chaldean, good to see you tonight. I appreciate the super chat. Abraham says, is Numbers 20 through 22, the Balaam story, an effective argument for multiple traditions and or God changing his mind? Haven't heard it used much, but it's absurd. So, man, Numbers 22 is wild. Actually, I just did a couple of readings of Numbers 22 with Dr. Josh and Kip Davis on Kip's channel, doing the reading of the Hebrew. And there's some crazy stuff about Balaam. First of all, is there a real Balaam in history? It appears to be. It seems to be that this narrative is playing on a real historical figure named Balaam. Whether or not it's an argument for multiple traditions, I don't really know. The verses that you specifically referenced, Numbers 22, 20 through 22, says, that night God came to Balaam and said to him, if the men have come to summon you, get up and go with them, but do only that I tell you to do. So Balaam got up in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the officials of Moab. I don't know how this particular passage would lead into a double tradition. I think personally there are better examples of double traditions in the Bible. I think the triplet of Abraham and Isaac having their wives taken because they're so beautiful, I think that triplet is much stronger. So initially Abraham goes into Egypt, the Pharaoh takes his wife, and then he goes to Gerar, the king of Gerar takes his wife, and then later Isaac and Rebekah go to Gerar. Somehow the same king, Abimelech, is still alive, and he tries to take Rebekah only to be, stopped ahead of time by someone who gave him advice. So there's some good triplets and there's some doublets, like the water from the rock is a doublet. There's another doublet about give me a second. Oh yeah, the Noah flood narrative has got doublets for sure. In fact, if you read the writings of Dr. Jennifer Bird, she put it in one of her recent books. But Richard Elliott Friedman talks about this in his book as well, who wrote the Bible, and he also outlines the sources in the Bible with sources revealed. You can also read about this and anyone else who talks about the documentary hypothesis, Joel S. Baden or some of the classics like Wellhausen or Casuto. They all touch on these double traditions. Exodus seems to have some double traditions as well. So there's some of that. It seems to be that the 10 Commandments were inserted into the Exodus narrative. Like if you remove the 10 Commandments from Exodus 20, it flows way better without the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments seems to be an intrusion on the narrative. But that being said, the donkey narrative of Balaam is silly. Was there a talking donkey? Listen, you got a lot of work ahead of you to convince me that there was a talking donkey. I don't believe it. I don't believe in talking donkeys and I don't believe in magic. So yeah, I think it's a silly story. But is it a doublet? I don't know. I don't personally think it is, but we've got some doublets there. Let me grab the next one. Euphemio. I'm so sorry I didn't get that right. I know I didn't get that right, but thank you for the $20 super chat. It says, what's up with Lot's daughter story? Cheers. That's a really good question. This is one of my favorite stories. So if you go to Genesis chapter all the way over to chapter 22, if I remember correctly. No, 22 is the Isaac narrative. Sorry, 19. Genesis 19. We have the destruction of Sodom, and something happens really strange after the destruction, where essentially we get this narration of Lot sleeping with his two daughters, and it's kind of poorly constructed. But here's the way it plays out. This is when they've escaped the destruction of Sodom. And then they're out in the wilderness. They end up holed up in a cave in the wilderness. It says, Lot went up out of Zoar and settled in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us. There's that language again. There's not a man to come into us in the manner of all the world. Let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. On the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, look, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night. So the younger rose and lay with him, and did not know whether she lay down or when she rose. Thus, both daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn, this is the important part, the firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites today. The younger also bore a son, named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day. Okay, so the important part about this text is that there's an argument being made in the subtext, which is that the ancestors, the Ammonites and the Moabites, the reason why there's tension between the Israelites and these other two people groups is because they were wicked. They came from a cursed lineage. Well, why was their lineage cursed? Well, it was cursed because this incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. And so this is how they're justifying the contention between the Israelites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites, which were real. These were real geopolitical problems. And this is not new. In fact, the cursing of lineages in the Bible due to what we would call illicit unions were pretty ubiquitous. In fact, I think that's what happened to Noah's wife, really, and Ham. I think Ham uncovered his father's nakedness, according to Leviticus, by sleeping actually with his mother in an attempt to restructure the authority now that the world was dead, just like Absalom was restructuring the authority by sleeping with his father's concubines. And that's why Canaan was cursed. And then all of the Canaanites were cursed, because Canaan was the offspring of that incestuous union. And in Deuteronomy 23, we get an interesting command where he says, those born of an illicit union shall not come into the assembly of the Lord, even unto the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall come into the assembly of the Lord. And we find elsewhere in the Torah where God says nobody is allowed to marry a Moabite. Nobody. They're completely ruled off, right? So they needed a backstory to explain what the hell is going on with the Moabites and the Ammonites. Why don't we like these people? And because theoretically, we kind of come from the same ancestry, don't we? We have a shared cultural heritage. Well, despite your ancestry, here's why you don't like the Ammonites and the Moabites. And that was the excuse. So the same reason why they justified the subjugation of the Canaanites, because in Genesis chapter 9, the Canaanites are cursed to serve the others, to serve the other offspring of Noah, namely Japheth and Shem. So Zariah, thank you so much for the super chat, says slavery apologetics says the people were evil and needed to be enslaved. Do we know what nations were around them and foreigners residing to them? That's a great question. So this is the problem with this slavery apologetic. This plays on Leviticus 25. Now, what we know is Leviticus 25, when it says that you can make slaves of the heathens that are round about you, according to the King James, or in the NRSV, it says the male and female slaves you may have is from the nations that are around you, meaning surrounding you. This cannot be the Canaanites, because the Canaanites, according to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and elsewhere, are meant to be completely annihilated. You're not supposed to just take them slaves. God wants you to annihilate them. At least there are 7 different Canaanite cities that are explicitly called out for complete annihilation. And we can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 20. God allows the taking of slaves, of foreigners, just not the foreigners that are Canaanites, right? So he says, when you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you as forced labor. If it does not accept your terms of peace and makes war against you, then you will besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all of its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your plunder the women, the children, livestock, and everything else as spoil. So theoretically, the women and children become slaves or concubines, one of the two. Most likely slaves. But was this true of the Canaanites? Of course not. It says, thus you shall treat all the towns that are very far from you, which are not the towns of the nations here. As for the towns of these people, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. Indeed, you shall annihilate them, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded. So the argument follows pretty well that the foreigners are just any foreigners. They could be Hittites, not the Hittites that are living in the land. Those are Hethites, the Hittites from Anatolia. They could be from Mari. They could be from the island of Crete. They could be from the Akkadian Empire. They could be from Egypt. In fact, the Egyptian, the slave of Sarah and Abraham was an Egyptian, right? So the foreigners are going to come down. The foreigners are going to be slaves of not the Canaanites, but anybody else. Now, here's the crazy thing that the slave apologist gets wrong. It's also true that the slaves could be even your own Hebrews, not just the foreigners. It says of the Hebrews, when you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. In the 7th year, you should go out a free person. That's if you're a man. If you're not a man, it says when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. So there are slaves that are even Hebrews. Now, it gets worse. It doesn't get better. It keeps getting worse. We learn about a third classification of slaves, which, let's imagine for a second that the foreigners were horrific, evil people that they needed to be enslaved. Cool. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit more. What about when you enslave these people and then they have children in your ownership? Should you eventually allow their children to go free now that the people that were wicked were essentially annihilated? Not according to the Bible. According to the Bible, it says when a Hebrew Israelite comes in to serve, it says if he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife will go out with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he will go out alone. So there are slaves that are literally born into slavery that have done nothing wrong. They haven't done anything to deserve being slaves. They are merely born into slavery, and God is completely okay with this. In fact, in Genesis 15, God blesses Abraham specifically with these types of slaves. In fact, he has them circumcised. It says but Abraham said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abraham said, you have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. So he's saying, listen, I've got slaves that are born in my house. And then again, God says, sorry, you're going to have an offspring. You're also going to have more slaves born in your house. He says, the Lord said to Abraham, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs and shall be slaves there. So he's now suggesting that, listen, there will be slaves and they're going to be oppressed. So the oppression of slavery is not a good thing, but needless to say, God is still going to bless Abraham with more slaves. Is that in chapter 14? Let me double check. Let's see. At some point in the Abraham narrative, it says that God was blessed with slaves. Let's see now. Shit. Was it 16? Sometimes I forget the verse I'm looking for. The term that we're looking for, though, is the home-born slave. There's a bunch of home-born slaves that you'll find. In fact, chapter 14 talks about home-born slaves going to war with Abraham in Genesis 14:14. And then there we go. Genesis 17:12 continues the tradition. So if we go to Genesis 17, about the circumcision, it says, throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 years old, including the slave born in your house. Oh, shit. Every generation? So God is setting up a system and a covenant, a permanent covenant with the people that includes slaves being born in the households of his people, which means, listen, the God of this book is just okay with slavery. A slave born into slavery is a slave who's done nothing wrong. There should never be second generation slaves. That's all there is to it. So I hope that answers your question. Randy Wilson, thank you so much for gifting out 5 Deconstruction Zone memberships. Big thank you, Randy. I appreciate that. And Wolven Joker, again with a super chat, thank you so much. It says, I love your takedowns of randos, but I would love to see a critical reading of the Bible, chapter by chapter. Share your Gnosis Bible Smackdown. Well, actually, Wolven, that's a good thing that you mentioned. I'm doing a Bible study right now on Sarah's channel called Leaving Faith. I haven't really moved all the episodes to my channel, but I'll be posting them to my channel eventually. But if you find Leaving Faith on YouTube, you'll find our Bible study that we started. We're starting in Genesis and we're working our way all the way through the Bible. And sometimes we cover multiple chapters. Sometimes we spend a whole hour on one chapter, covering the in-depth detail in each section of the Bible. Now, it is on her channel, which means I'm allowing her to go through the Bible and ask me questions, and I'm there to read the Bible with her at her disposal. So there's some stuff that like it may not come up just because it wasn't part of her dialogue, because I'm a guest on her show. But I would highly encourage everyone here to go find Leaving Faith on YouTube and follow that YouTube channel. In fact, let me pull it up so you guys can see the screen, see her profile. Because she's wicked smart, and she's been in the deconstruction space for quite some time, and she does go live on the channel. But it's Leaving Faith. Dog Ruby is in the thing in the profile picture. So go find Leaving Faith on TikTok and YouTube, and you can see our Bible study there. But thank you so much for the super chat. And also, Acme Hero again with another super chat says, will you debate Theologian Scholars 2 in 25? Well, I don't really know. So here's my policy on debates, and this has been my policy since day one. My policy has always been this. My goal is not to go out on the internet and track people down and debate them. My goal has never been to defeat the apologists. My goal is to do honest deconstruction debates and chats, and to talk to people that are seriously questioning. You know what I mean? So like when I got online, I had no idea I'd be debating anybody. I thought I'd just be doing deconstruction content. Excuse me, I got a burp. I thought I'd be doing deconstruction content. It just happened to be every time I went live, Christians wanted to debate me. So I was like, fuck, I guess we'll debate. So now it's like all I do. That being said, it's not my goal to go out on the internet and debate everybody. It's not my thing. I let people come to me. I think when people come to my live stream, I think it makes them think, and it gives the audience something to think about as well. I don't know if many people, well, maybe some are. I don't know how many people are legitimately persuaded by me going on like modern day debates and debating somebody. I think what happens on those platforms is everybody from each side files in, and it's like watching a basketball game or football game. You're just there rooting for your side. I don't know how many people in those debates are really questioning things. But I think what we're doing on TikTok and YouTube when we're having these live streams, I think there's a lot of people that are filtering in that are seriously questioning. So, and I get messages from them. I get a lot of people that were like, listen, I was looking for deconstruction content on TikTok or on YouTube and I found you. And I'm really persuaded by these arguments. But Randy, thank you for gifting out 5 DZ memberships. I really appreciate that. We did finally break the 1,000 membership mark, guys. We're just over 1,000 now. So we have to figure out what our next goal is. Maybe the next goal is going to be 1,200. We'll see. But let's keep the team growing. And Steven, thank you so much for the $5 super chat. It says, I gotta grant it to Doug. He's our rock. Amazing play on words. Doug is taking the internet by storm. I never knew that Doug is going to be so popular. I had no idea. I originally brought Doug out just to do a live stream suggesting that a pet rock and Jesus provide the same level of benefit cognitively and psychologically. If you are having trouble with needing something, you can just get yourself a pet rock. You don't need Jesus for nothing. They have the same. They got the same amount of effect on the real world. And then so I took a rock and I put googly eyes on it because I didn't have a pet rock, and people loved it and they wanted me to name it. And somebody suggested I name it Doug, and I said, "Shit, that's a great name. How do you get rocks? You dig for them." And it's such a good, unassuming name too. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't think that there's a god named Doug, and shit. Doug just took off, took the world by storm. I can only assume that because Doug is the rock of salvation. Ligma, thank you so much for the super chat. Good to see you tonight, my friend. Ligma says, I had thought Paul in 1 Thessalonians saying God's wrath has finally come to the Jews was referring to the Jewish-Roman war, but the dates don't line up. Any skepticism in the dating of 1 Thessalonians? So that's actually a really good point. And here's what I know about Jewish Roman history. So Paul theoretically, I think, was writing in the late 50s. It's possible he wrote Thessalonians early. No doubt most scholars believe that. Here's the problem with Thessalonians. Most scholars agree, and it matches the timeline in Acts, that the letter to Thessalonians was the earliest letter. 1 Thessalonians, as far as most New Testament scholars are concerned, is probably the first letter that Paul wrote. And that's why it reflects this idea that Jesus is due back imminently. He's coming anytime. So to push Thessalonians out and say that it was written after 70 AD is going to be a hard sell in biblical academics, as it's the one letter that people think it comes first. So I don't know if that's a good sell. Now, here's what I know about the Jews. The Jews and also the Romans were at war, where there was a lot of tension between the Jews and the Romans even prior to the invasion of 68. In fact, the Jewish-Roman wars actually started as early as 63. There was already these pretenses and skirmishes that were coming about. Rebellions, you might even call them. In fact, in the letter of Corinthians, I believe 2 Corinthians, they even take up an offering for the persecuted church in Jerusalem because they weren't faring so well, because the Romans were already having a lot of run-ins with the Jews. So it's easy to see like the invasion of the Jews between 68 and 70 when they destroyed Jerusalem and think that that was the thing happening between the Jews and the Romans. But there was actually quite a few dust-ups between the Jews and the Romans between the time of Jesus and between the full-scale invasion. So the full-scale invasion in 68 with Titus was putting an end to the animosity between the Jews and the Romans that already existed. So when we look at what was happening to the Jews by the Romans prior to 68, there's a lot of good stuff to point to suggest that no. The smackdown that was happening was real. What happened in 70, I think, was a whole different story. There was some smackdown already happening, some cracking of the whip that was already happening before 68 that I think Paul was referring to. That's my personal opinion. I hope that was a thorough enough question. We could probe deeper into Roman Jewish history. I don't know if it's necessary, but just know that the Roman incursions in Palestine were many, even before the destruction in 70. And Jay from the land of Hela, thank you for the super chat, says, why is more not made of God lying in Genesis 2:17? So here's the thing. I agree. God said something that simply wasn't true, which shouldn't happen, because according to 1 Samuel and according to Numbers 19:23, God says, he says, God is not a man that he should lie, not a mortal that he should change his mind, something along those lines. So what's happening in Genesis 2:17 when God said, surely in the day that you eat of it, you shall die? One of two things is happening. Either he lied, maybe he was exaggerating the threat, and he didn't really mean they were going to die. He just wanted to prevent them from eating the fruit. You could say that. Did he change his mind? I think he changed his mind personally. I think he changed his mind. I don't think the God of the Old Testament's all-knowing. Everything we know about the God of the Old Testament is that he's not all-knowing. He says in Deuteronomy 13 and elsewhere that he is testing people to know what they will do, to know what is in their heart. When he tests Abraham in Genesis 22, and the angel of the Lord stops him from stabbing his son. He says, now I know that indeed you will obey me, even not withholding your only son from me. In Genesis 18, when he visits with Abraham and he says, the outcry of Sodom has risen up to me, and I must come down now and see if the outcry is as what it seems to be, and then I will know. It's a God who doesn't know things. So to me, reading Genesis in Genesis 2:17, there's a God who doesn't know if Adam and Eve is actually going to sin. And so he sets up this situation to test them to see if they're going to sin. And he says, in the day that you eat of it, you will die. And then when it happens, he's like, well, I got to have some mercy. I can't just kill them. So I'll just remove them from the garden and no longer give them access to the tree of life. And there they won't live forever. If God is all-knowing, which I don't think he is, and he said this, and if God didn't lie, then the only other recourse you have is to do what Christians always do and say words don't mean words. Day doesn't really mean day. When he says, in the day that you eat of it, you will die. Well, day couldn't mean day, and they'll bend themselves into pretzels arguing for how a day isn't really a day. Or they'll say, well, death doesn't really mean death. It means something else. It's a spiritual death. And they'll bend themselves into pretzels trying to defend the idea, that the phrase, muth mot in Hebrew means something other than surely you will die. So you'll get those pretzels. But my personal opinion, I just think he changed his mind. That's all I think. Or he uttered a threat, just trying to prevent them from doing the thing. One of those two. But thanks for the question. And Mr. Morpheus, thank you for the super chat. Good to see you tonight, my friend. He says, if Jesus's family thought he was crazy, referring to Mark chapter 3, he says, why do people think he was sane? LOL, Justin, check your email. I'm so sorry. I'm kind of backed up on my email. I apologize. I try to actually respond to all the email. I promise, Mr. Morpheus, I'll check my email and get back to you. But yeah, so that's a really good point. So this happens elsewhere, but I think the first example is Mark chapter 3. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus' own family thinks he's out of his mind. In fact, the actual Greek text that we find there, directly translated, would be he is beside himself, meaning his cognitive faculties are no longer in his body. So it's kind of an idiom the way that it's worded. But so Jesus is out there talking to these multitude of people, and his family goes and attempts to detain him, thinking that he's out of his own mind. In fact, let me pull it up. It says, then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and brothers. So his family were like going to round him up. But this is a really fun passage where they think that he's casting out demons in the name of Beelzebub, and you get the whatchamacallit, the unforgivable sin. But in the same passage, let's see, was it in Mark or was it in Matthew, where it says that he was literally out of his mind? Let me grab that real quick. Oh, it was in Mark. I must have skipped over it. Mark chapter 3, verse 20. Yeah, sorry. It says, then he went home, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind. Yeah, so here's the thing. If Jesus' own well, this is a double-edged sword, Mr. Morpheus, just so you know. If people think that his own family thought he was out of his mind, maybe he was. But here's what the apologists would say. The apologists would say, but in Mark, his own family didn't believe him. They thought he was out of his mind. But his own brother James converted, and we get the Gospel of James, which means James once thought he was out of his mind, and then James converted. So that's what the apologists would say. Now, here's what you should know about James, though. Most scholars don't believe James wrote James. In fact, a lot of the early church fathers rejected James. James, as far as we can tell from the evidence that we have, was written way after James would have lived. I mean, way after James would have lived. In fact, James, the brother of Jesus, was murdered quite early in church tradition. He was one of the earliest martyrs, which means he would have had to write his letter, like, I don't know, around the same time as Paul or prior to Paul, or roughly the same time as Paul. But his letter, the book of James, is written as a rebuttal to the writings of Paul. Whoever wrote James is clearly writing to counteract this whole faith alone notion that Paul is putting forward. So it had to come after Paul. But everything we have from church history, that, and even Josephus, would lead us to believe that James was murdered very early. He was a very early martyr. It's just a weird thing. The book of James has got a lot of problems. I don't think that James even wrote James, to be honest. I think is just playing on the name of James. The same way we've got letters theoretically written by Paul that weren't written by Paul, like 2 Timothy certainly wasn't written by Paul. But anyways, Satan, welcome in, Satan. Good to have the Dark Lord in the house. Satan says, hi, Justin. Whatever it's claimed in the book of Job, I didn't do it. Doug is my witness. Love your show. By the way, am committed atheist. Good luck. Hey, thank you so much, Satan. I really appreciate that. And you're right. We will not let God off the hook for what happened in Job chapter 1 and 2 and beyond, because God was the one that brought it up. God was the one that gave permission. And in fact, if you read carefully, down in verse 16 in the book of Job, God even kills people himself. It says, the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants at the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. Listen, if the fire of God is falling from heaven and executing people, guess who the fuck is responsible for that? It's the God who is in control of the fire of God. That's it. Nobody's responsible. So even if you want to say, well, yeah, even though God gave Satan permission, Satan's still on the hook. Well, guess what? He's not on the hook for all of it. At a minimum, you have to admit that God sent fire from heaven to kill a bunch of the servants after what was left of the Sabaeans. But good question, or good statement rather. Rock hard for Doug, but I love the name every time I see it. Rock Rock hard for Doug, guys. Rock hard for Doug all day and all night. Thank you for the super chat. It says the 4 Gospels have 4 different ways that the tomb was discovered and what happens next. How do Christians reconcile this? And have you heard James Tabor theory on the initial tomb being temporary? Okay. That's a good question. I love James Tabor. I actually haven't heard his theory on the empty tomb narrative, which is surprising. I've heard most of his stuff on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I've heard a lot of his other stuff and read some of his stuff elsewhere, but I haven't heard this particular theory. But you're right. There's a lot of conflicting evidence, and the apologist doesn't have a lot of answer for it. That being said, did I add this to the cheat sheet yet? If not, let me look at it real quick. I might not have added it yet. Okay, so I added a timeline to the cheat sheet of the Passover to show you how when you put the timelines together between the 4 Gospels, they don't actually line up. So that's in there. I meant to add another tab that I didn't add yet. I'm so sorry that I didn't add it. I have another timeline that I put together of the resurrection account. I'll make sure I add it this week, where I lay out what was happening in the timeline of the resurrection account, where you can clearly see the problems. And to me, the biggest problem with the resurrection account is who was there first. And I think this explains the late ending added to Mark. And I'll explain why. So the Gospel of Mark originally did not have Mary Magdalene at the tomb. It just had the group of women showing up at the tomb and then leaving and not really telling anybody. Now, we have a longer ending of Mark that seems to have come much later. And what do we find in the longer ending of Mark? We find that Mary Magdalene shows up at the tomb all by herself, alone first, before anybody else. And you have to ask yourself, why would this ending be added to Mark? Well, I'll tell you why. Because John was written late. The other 2 Gospels, Matthew and Luke, were riffing off of Mark. And then we have some additional details that get added to the resurrection account, but you can harmonize some of these additional details. You can say, well, Mark didn't include the story of the women going off and telling anyone, but Matthew and Luke did. They're just adding to the story, even though there's a big problem with, was it the angel that rolled away the stone? Was it rolled away when they got there, or did it roll away after they get there? There's some questions there. Why did the angel tell them something outside the tomb and then 2 angels tell them the identical same thing inside of the tomb? There's a lot of weird questions there. But the problem we have is once the Gospel of John comes along, John fucks everything up, because John starts out in chapter 21 stating that Mary Magdalene went alone to the tomb before sunrise. And the other Gospel says that the women went to the tomb at sunrise, which seems to be suggesting that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb by herself. John does this a lot. John really screws up the timeline of the other Gospels. Now, the problem you have here is if Mary Magdalene was the first one to witness the resurrected Jesus, which happens in John. In chapter 1, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, realizes it's empty, that the stone is rolled away, goes back and gets Peter. Peter and Mary Magdalene and John the Beloved have a foot race basically back to the tomb. And as Paul and John leave and Mary Magdalene is left at the tomb, she encounters who she thinks is the gardener. She doesn't even recognize him because it's not really Jesus. It's probably just some dude pretending to be Jesus, and has an encounter. So Mark, somebody recognizing that, man, there's this really weird detail. Mark doesn't have a lot of content at the ending of it that includes this stuff from John. So there's a longer ending to Mark that gets added later. And I think the longer ending of Mark was added later to harmonize the Gospel of Mark with the Gospel of John. They must have had some overlap in their communities. So they added this longer ending to Mark that harmonizes Mark with the Gospel of John. And then in doing so, makes even more problems. Because if you read John very, very carefully, there's a case to be made that Mary Magdalene didn't go to the tomb alone, and that whoever wrote the longer ending of Mark just wasn't reading careful enough. Because when Mary Magdalene goes to the disciples to report that the tomb is empty, she says, they have taken his body and we don't know where it's been taken. Which means it's possible that the Gospel of John just didn't mention the other women. It's possible. So Mark is trying to fix something, and he probably inadvertently breaks even more than he fixes. But that's what I think is happening. I will add it to the cheat sheet this week. I'll add in my spreadsheet tab of all 4 Gospels and the resurrection contradictions to the cheat sheet. And then you guys will have access to that. So definitely, I apologize for not adding it. I kind of thought I did. But Vinny Angel's Rock and Roll Bedroom, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate that. Good to see you tonight, my friend. Vinny actually does some deconstruction atheist music on YouTube, so follow him over on YouTube. But Vinny says, have you ever read Letters from Earth by Mark Twain? He really cooks Genesis, Numbers, and the New Testament in the voice of Satan by only 58 pages. It's absolutely glorious. And new music soon. Well, I'm glad new music is dropping soon, actually. But no, actually, I haven't read that. And I got to be honest, I'm a little surprised that I haven't read that. Now I want to look it up. Let's see. Letters from Earth. There we go, from Mark Twain. Listen, it's on my reading list. I've got it saved up on my tabs. Thanks for the recommendation. I appreciate that. Sometimes this is the thing I love about the deconstruction community is like, I get to constantly learn from other people, rather than it's not just me on an island. Like, we're all here making each other better, which is, amazing to me. So thank you for the recommendation, Vinny. I'm going to give that a look. And Meg, welcome in tonight. Thank you so much for the super chat. Meg says, is there something in the Bible that not only condones using a rod to discipline slaves, but encourages it to keep them from doing wrong? Kinda. Yeah, there is. Okay. So I would go first to Exodus 21, verses 20 through 21. So let me grab Exodus 21. So in the same chapter that talks about Hebrew slaves and the homeborn slaves, it says this. I don't know. I don't know how this window got. Because I adjusted it over here. I shouldn't have. There we go. It says, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there's no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. So, what we're seeing here in the text, Meg, is that if you intentionally beat somebody so bad that they immediately die, because that obviously was your goal, then you're going to get punished for that. That's going to be a bad day for you. In fact, if this is a Hebrew, you might get killed yourself. Now, in verse 21, though, it says, if the slave survives a day or two, there's no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. A lot of translations, I think the NIV was the most recent, tries to soften it. And it'll say, if the slave survives after a day or two. That's not what it says in Hebrew at all. And it doesn't even make sense for the passage. And it doesn't agree with any of the ancient authorities, the rabbinic sources commenting on the Hebrew. It says, if the slave stands for a day or two, which doesn't mean survive after a day or two. You would need the phrase achari to refer to after a day or two. You don't get that. Says, if the slave stands for a day or two, there's no punishment because the slave is the owner's property. So what's actually happening here is he's suggesting that if the slave dies later, a couple days later, it's presumed that you didn't murder your slave because, listen, your slave is your property. We're going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you didn't murder your slave if they die a couple days later, because then you would lose out your investment. And who would do that? You see what I'm saying? So that seems to be what the passage is saying, is that, listen, you can beat your slave, you can beat them so severely that, hell, if they accidentally unalive, there it is. But there are further limitations because, excuse me, I'm so sorry. If you knock out the tooth or the eye, of your Hebrew slave, they get to go free. This is one of the reasons why most scholars agree that this chapter is just dealing with Hebrew slaves, and I agree with them. So if you knock out the tooth or the eye of your Hebrew slave, then they get their freedom. They're not permanent slaves. This was something granted only to Hebrews because they were temporary slaves. So there's that. Now, does the Bible endorse the beating of slaves by rods? Good question. Jesus talks a little bit about reprimanding slaves, about like the treatment of slaves, but he never advocates for beating slaves. So I don't know if we can point to Jesus or the New Testament to suggest that Jesus was okay with beating slaves, but it could be that there's a passage I'm missing that I haven't thought of, but it's not, it's not coming to me at the moment. So I'll have to think on that. But the New Testament does tell slaves that even if you have abusive masters, that you have to put up with it. But Paul instructs slave owners to treat slaves kindly in Ephesians chapter 6. So I don't know. There's a case to be made that the slave beating is softened. But listen, you're still supposed to beat your child with a rod too. And according to Mark chapter 7, Jesus is even okay with killing children that curse their mother and father. So there's that. Thanks for the question. Ligma says, how have you heard Christians reconcile the blatant opposing views on faith/works between Paul and James? Your thoughts on it? So this is a good one. And here's how it was reconciled when I was in the church. Here's what people would have said. They would have said, your salvation is through faith alone, but if you're truly saved, then you will have works. So they would say, when you go to James chapter 1 and chapter 2, James isn't saying that you're saved by your works. He's just saying that if you are saved, you will have works. So that's kind of the way that the apologist is going to treat it. I don't know if that's a great way to read it. Oh my gosh. I've been online too long today. Sorry. So I don't know if that's the best way to read it, because even Jesus, look at the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 25. How are the people divided in sheep and goats between hell and heaven? Well, they're divided based on who did the good works. Who visited me in prison? Who gave me food to eat? Who gave me water to drink? Who gave me a coat to wear when I was cold? That kind of stuff. Those are all works. Those are all works of righteousness. So Jesus and James actually agree on this idea of salvation coming through actually being righteous. In fact, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus describes following the law of Moses as making you great in the kingdom of heaven. Apologists have no answer for this. They just don't. The best that they're going to do is they're going to say, well, yeah. God wants you to follow the moral parts of the law. You shouldn't abandon the moral parts of the law, but you do need to abandon the ritual, and you need to abandon the sacrificial part of the law. So they think, well, yeah, we can get rid of the works of the law, just not the moral parts of the law. They wouldn't consider the moral parts of the law to be works. And that's a functional method of getting rid of this problem. I don't think it's a good one. I don't think it really fixes the problem. But I think that's the best they have. I think that's the only answer you're going to get. But James says something really good on this. In fact, let me grab what James says in chapter 2. Because James says some scathing stuff. I love James on this particular topic. He says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Surely that faith cannot save it. It cannot. So what James is saying is, listen, if you have faith, but then you don't have works alongside of it, you're not really saved. He's saying, surely that faith cannot save. If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, you do not supply their bodily needs, what what is the good of that? Faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Which is, isn't that crazy? That's just what Jesus said. Jesus said to feed and clothe the needy. And that is how he's judging people when he comes back. And then James goes on and says, some will say you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will by my works show you my faith. And then he says something really interesting here. It says, you believe that God is one and you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. So he's saying, listen, even the demons believe. Having faith and believing isn't what you think it is. Simply having a state of belief isn't good enough. That doesn't make you righteous. You can't be righteous just by believing something. So anyways, he said, and he addresses elsewhere where it talks about Abraham being justified by faith alone. It says, was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Holy shit. So James is very difficult to reconcile with the faith alone argument. I think the best way to handle this is to do a faith plus works argument, which is what the Catholics do. When I was in Catholic school, they would have appealed to faith and works, not faith alone, and not works alone either. In the Catholic tradition, you need faith and you need works. You can't have just one of them. So I appreciate the question. Really good question. All right, let me grab, let's see, the next one from Bruce. Thank you so much, Bruce, for the $9.99 super chat. It says, why do the KJV only crowd think their Bible is the shit and others are corrupt? How'd that come about? Thanks for fighting the good fight. Praise Doug. So this is a topic that I don't get to talk about, but I should. In fact, even when I was a Christian, this was a topic that I spent a shit ton of time debating. I'll update the cheat sheet eventually of all the errors in the King James, so you guys can have that. I've got a list I've been collecting of them. I've already got like 30 or 40 errors in the King James Bible. But so here's the thing. The pushback against other translations happened, I think primarily because people love tradition. They hate change. They especially hate change in the Bible. I'm going to give you a good example. I had a professor who was tasked with writing a commentary. I think it was part of the Pillar New Testament Commentary series, or maybe the Tyndale New Testament Commentary series. I forget which one. And she was lamenting that, you know, when you do your commentary, you have to do your own translation. And she was lamenting that the editors, the publishers, had some ground rules over which passages can be translated differently than the original. And she was saying most scholars of the New Testament are aware that the Lord's Prayer has some translation difficulties in a lot of the English rendering, especially the way the King James has it, and needs to be massaged a little bit. But a lot of them are forbidden to retranslate the Lord's Prayer because it's such a sacred text that people will stop buying the Bible. And I think that's what happened when the King James Bible got so popular and it was out for so long, and then new translations came out like the RSV that had changes and modifications to it. People lost their minds because they grew up on this particular translation and they couldn't imagine another Bible, say like removing a passage or changing a passage, and like, oh my God, they're changing the Bible. But the reality is they're not changing the Bible. They're fixing problems in the King James Version. But if you don't know Greek and Hebrew and you're not familiar with textual criticism, then you're not going to know that they're actually fixing a problem. You're going to think that they're changing something. But the same argument can be done by taking the Geneva. So I got a copy of the Geneva. Hold on. So I've got a copy of the Geneva from 1560. If you compare the Geneva from 1650 to the King James Bible, you'll find that there's some stuff in the King James Bible from the Geneva that doesn't line up. They don't actually match. So would we make an argument that we should get rid of the King James Bible in favor of the Geneva just because they changed some passages? No, most Christians would say no. But that's because they didn't grow up reading the Geneva Bible. They grew up reading the King James. And I'll say one last thing on this. The power of tradition to entrap people is strong. It's really strong. I had a pastor friend named Mike who worked at a Presbyterian church. And I've told this story. I apologize for those who've heard it, but it's such a good story. A pastor friend named Mike who recognized that in the nave of the church, the altar was in kind of a precarious position, wasn't a good position. It needed to be moved backwards in the nave. So he mentioned to some of the elders that he wanted to move the altar, and they were like, nope, don't do it. Do not move this altar. And it's like, why? Like with the previous pastor nearly got fired over moving the altar because so many people, that even the layout of the church was that way for so long that when somebody actually did move something, people revolted. People stopped going to church because somebody moved the altar. So Mike, being a smart man, said, fine then, I'll fix the problem. And like every other week, he moved that altar like an inch at a time, so slowly that the congregants didn't even notice it until he got the altar into a better position. And nobody ever gave him grief over it. And that's how he solved it. Because the tradition of just, I need it to always be the same is strong. It's so strong in the religious mind. And even another pastor friend that I used to work with, he decided one day, he was Lutheran, he was going to stop wearing robes. He was tired of wearing robes. He stopped wearing robes. I'm not joking. He started showing in a suit. People left the church. People left the damn church over the pastor saying, I don't think I want to wear a robe anymore. Fucking crazy. So yeah, am I surprised that people get entrenched in King James onlyism? No, that's so expected for the religious mindset. Anyways, let me get the next one. Chris, welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite. You should have in your members perks a link to the Deconstruction cheat sheet. And Dougie D, excellent name. Thank you so much for the super chat. Says, is there a dispensation for those of us who has been blessed by the Lord Doug's name? Well, here, we are in the dispensation of Doug. We're in the double D, guys. We are currently in the dispensation of Doug, the double D dispensation. So guys, make the most of it. Make sure you're rock hard for Doug in the double Ds. Okay, guys? Do not miss out on Doug's favor. And Gus, thank you so much for the $2 super chat. It says, Dougists, Dougite, Doug-ish. Are Christians Douglas? Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Are followers of... See, that's the miracle of Dougism. The miracle of Dougism is that people that don't even believe in Doug are still part of Doug. Even though they say that we are Douglas, you can't get rid of it because Doug is still in Douglas. You can never escape. Doug is omnipresent, guys. Doug is omnipresent, omnipotent. He is omni-hard as well. Omni-hard. Harder than diamonds. And we agree with you, Bill. Bill says, God didn't create man, man created God. And I've never agreed with something more than that. And Reverend Ricky Skaggs, good to see you tonight, friend. Thank you so much for the super chat. Says, just wanted to show my support. Keep cooking and keep blessing of Doug in your stones. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the continued support, my good friend, Reverend Ricky Skaggs. I love the name too, by the way. There's a Family Guy joke in there somewhere. I can't remember it though. But anyways, Andre Romero, thank you so much for the 109. Is that ruples? I don't know what the R stands for. I'm going to assume it's ruples. And it says, in your experience, who is more stubborn and unbearable, a Calvinist, an Eastern Orthodox, or a Catholic? I think the average Catholic is calm, but the radical Catholic Opus Dei style is more dangerous than others. So that's a very good point. Okay, so here's my thought. I think the most stubborn category of believer is when you're debating the Bible, at least. Like if you're debating the Bible, the most stubborn and annoying is probably the Calvinist. The Calvinist is always convinced that they're a 1,000,000% right and they can't be wrong. And they just want to beat you over the head with the scripture. So that's super annoying. And the other annoying thing is that, like, I don't know, there's enough passages in the Bible that you could make a good case for Calvinism being true, actually. And they know that. They know that Romans chapter 9 is a huge problem for non-Calvinists. Now, the second in line has got to be the Ortho Bros. Listen, I don't know what they're teaching people over there. I don't know what they're doing. But the Ortho Bros are unbearable. The problem with Ortho Bros is they think that because they studied philosophy and because they don't have to study the Bible, meaning they can just study philosophy and agree with the authority of the church. And as long as you don't press them on what the Bible means or what the Bible says, they can hold on to this thing. And when you try to dialogue with them, what do? They run away from the Bible at all costs. They will do anything other than read the Bible. What they want to do is deviate and go to philosophy, go to church authority because they think that they're safe, but they're not safe. These are just dumb pivots to get away from the actual argument. But a really good question, and I think the days of radical Catholicism, I could be wrong, I think are pretty much over at this point. But there was a while in which Catholicism, was the most dangerous religion on the planet. If you look at the amount of people that were killed just in the Inquisitions, not the Inquisitions, the Inquisition, sorry. There's a lot. Millions of people died in the Inquisitions. Millions of people died in the wars that were created from the church schisms, the religious wars. They were deadly. And if you read any of the historical writings from the time period, they were killing entire people groups. There's a people group referred to as the Waldenses. And the kings issued edicts. They got together and jointly issued edicts saying, if you find anybody who's a member of this Walden's sect, kill them. Kill their family. If you know anyone who even associates with them, go round those fuckers up and kill them. That's what they were doing. That's how dangerous this church was. Jam and Jay, thank you so much for the $4 super chat. Says, is there any validity to the washing of the feet in the book of Ruth, meaning something sexual? And was she possibly LGBTQ? Woe to the Douglas. Okay, so you got two questions in there, and they're pretty good. Here's my thought, okay? I think both of these interpretations are a little bit reaching. So the interpretation of the washing of the feet is a little bit of a conflation between what Ruth does to Boaz and what Jesus does at the Last Supper. So what I've heard people saying is that, well, when Ruth went to go lie with Boaz on the threshing floor, she went and she uncovered his feet, lifted up the corner of his garment and uncovered his feet. Now, we've got enough historical data to suggest that this may or may not be a sexual union. I don't think it is. I don't think there's enough evidence there. I think what she was doing was she was making herself available for him. Now, she was doing it in a very dangerous way. In fact, the people that saw her there would have assumed that she's a prostitute, which is another layer to the story. So from a social and economic standpoint, when the farmers went to the threshing floor to do their grain work, these were times of party, times of where everyone would get together and join in on the work, like pressing wine. And they'd come and they'd have big old parties. And a lot of times prostitutes would come in where all these partying men would be. And it would be expected for prostitutes to be around the threshing floor during the season of threshing. So that's why she had to get out in a hurry so that she wouldn't be seen, is they would have assumed that she's a prostitute. Now, it seems to be, though, that she didn't sleep with Boaz, because later there's a whole ritual that needs to be performed to dictate whether or not Boaz was going to take her as her kinsman redeemer, which, if he already slept with her and he's a righteous man, it would have been presumed that he would have just married her and done the thing. They wouldn't have need to go through the whole charade of getting permission from her other nearest of kin before he married her. It would have been presumed that he would have had to marry her because he already slept with her. So what I think happened on the threshing floor was she made herself available in a similar manner that the other prostitutes would have suggested that they were available. But I don't think that uncovering the feet meant that she slept with him. Now, some people will think that the uncovering of the feet was a reference to uncovering of the genitals, because sometimes uncovering the genitals could refer to, in Leviticus, it talks about sexual unions as uncovering the nakedness of your so-and-so. So they make the leap and they say, well, uncovering the feet is a reference for uncovering the genitals, and uncovering the genitals is a reference to having sex. I think these are leaps that aren't really in the text. It seems likely in this particular case that the uncovering the feet was literally just her, we'll say, crawling into bed with Boaz, or symbolically asking, and I think this is what most scholars agree with, uncovering the feet and lying under the corner of the blanket and asking for Boaz to take the corner of his garment and put it over her, is her asking for the protection of Boaz to bring her into union, to bring her into relationship. Now, that being said, in order to think that when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, that was something sexual, you have to already make a bunch of bad assumptions about Ruth to get to that conclusion, that when Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, that was actually the genitals. I think that's a dumb thing to say, because washing the feet is ubiquitous in the ancient world. People did it all the time. So we would then have to go into the Bible and say every time somebody had their feet washed, they had sex. That would be a silly thing to impose on the Bible. And the last thing was whether or not Ruth was in a same-sex relationship with her mother-in-law. No, I don't think so. There's a suggestion that Naomi and Ruth had a relationship because they were living together. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that the fact that they were living together was because she had nowhere else to go. She had nowhere else to take care of her, no other way to take care of her, because her husband's dead. So when your husband dies, you have to ask yourself, well, where the hell do I go now? And Ruth is a good option, especially when you consider it levirate marriage. Levirate marriage sought to keep you in the family. So there's something there. I don't particularly think that she was a lesbian. I think these are like really over the top readings that are really stretching the meaning of the text to make it sound more interesting, when I don't think it's actually there. So hopefully that answered your question. Lee, thank you for the $5 super chat. Says, good day, Justin. Is there a description of heaven in the Bible? I'm glad you mentioned. The closest you can get is Revelation 7 and Revelation 21, where it talks about the new heaven and new earth. There's going to be no more sorrow, no more tears, no more death. All that stuff's done away with. The idea of a heaven being disconnected from the earth, for example, a mystical kingdom far away where people's spirits go to when they die, that's not in the Bible anywhere. That's completely made up by modern thinkers. The idea of heaven in the Bible is the literal fucking sky. That's what heaven was. Uranos in the Greek and Hashemayim in Hebrew refers to the actual sky. When it talks about the gods being in the sky, they meant the literal sky. That's why when Ezekiel goes to the throne room of God, it's at the firmament, the edge of the sky. That's why when they go up on the mountain in Exodus 24, they find God at the top of the mountain because it was the top of the mountain that was touching the skies. That's why they built ziggurats, and they thought that gods could come and rest at the top room in the ziggurat. And guess what they called the ziggurats? They called the ziggurats the stairway between heaven and earth, or the gateway of the gods. Or some of the ziggurats were even named it was named the Mountain of God, because they believed that you could get to God's domain by merely getting into the skies. And that's why God had to destroy the tower in Genesis 11, because they were afraid that mankind would build a tower tall enough to reach the heavens, and then mankind could storm the heavens. In fact, if you read the book of Jasher, this is explained in the book of Jasher, how they thought they would storm the heavens. And even in the writings of Gilgamesh, or the narrative of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh says, who can climb up to the skies and reach immortality by getting into the heavens? They believed that the heavens was the sky. It wasn't a mystical kingdom far away. That's something that modern people had to put into the text. Once they realized that there's nothing special up in the skies. There's no gods up there. There's no special kingdom. There's no firmament. So then they had to go back into the text and say, well, shit, heaven must be a mystical kingdom far away. Hope that answers your question. And 123, thank you for the super chat, says, who is someone you really want to debate and why? So I think I touched on this earlier. You know, I don't have a desire to go out and debate people. Like, I never got into debates thinking I'm going to go and be the best debater and debate everybody. It's not my goal. My goal is not to be a competitive debater. My goal is to present the truth any way that I can do it. And it just happens to be that debating on TikTok and YouTube happens to draw the most eyes and ears. So that's why I do it. I don't have any aspirations. I don't have any dreams of being a competitive debater and debating everybody alive, or like cooking the apologists. It happens a lot, but that's not my goal. In fact, I think people that are obsessed with that, like there's a lot of people that are challenging me to debate them all the time because they want to be the one to bring me down. Like for them, it's a competition. To me, that's silly and childish. I don't think debating is a competition. I'm here in the marketplace of ideas because I think that ideas matter. I don't give a fuck who I'm debating. It doesn't matter to me. I have no desire to go out and be known as the number one debater. It's not a competition for me. I want to make people aware of truth and the dangers of religion. And it happens to be that debating seems to be the best way to do it. It's not a competition to me. I don't care if my name gets big doing this. It means nothing to me. I just want people to know what's true. Also, welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite Nobody. Hey, you're not nobody. You're somebody to me. Thank you for subscribing. And Larry Beck, thank you for the 666. Hail Nero. And he says, you do pretty work, Justin. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And the Christians crashing out in the comments, just know that nobody hurt me. He says, who hurt you so bad that you're running such a channel? Nobody hurt me, HOS. Not a single person. The idea that you think that somebody has to be hurt in order to have an opinion different from yours is problematic. You're the reason why I do this, because you're toxic. The way you think is toxic. You can't look at somebody who disagrees with you and think that this is an honest person that just came to a different conclusion than me. You have to believe that something horrible happened to me or that somehow I'm mentally deficient, because you are toxic, and you're toxic because your religion teaches you to be toxic. You're the reason. Let's get a whole round of L's for people who think that you have to be hurt by a religion to not agree with it. Paper Bag Man, good to see you tonight. Thank you for the $5 super chat. Says, good to see you streaming again. Hypothetically, if Christianity were true, would the view that Jesus already returned be a valid view? Listen, the only way to fix the problem of the second coming is to get rid of some of the books of the Bible. So you got to get rid of Revelation. You got to get rid of Thessalonians. You got to get rid of Matthew chapter 25. That didn't happen. You got to get rid of Matthew chapter 16 and whatnot. That leaves you theoretically with Matthew 10:23, where he says he'll come again, but he doesn't say what he's going to do. But like, to me, these are worthless claims. Like, so for example, we have this idea that like the resurrection could serve as the Jesus came back. So he wasn't a liar. But like, listen, if Jesus coming back actually happened, we would expect that it matches what the Old Testament says. Namely, that he'll be here forever, that there will always be a king on the throne, that there will be world peace. So Christianity simply cannot be true unless you get rid of the entire Old Testament, you get rid of Revelation, you get rid of everything Jesus said about the second coming, and you get rid of like 3/4 of the Bible. Then you could say that Jesus coming back from the dead somehow makes Christianity true. But until you can throw out most of the Bible, you can never say that the second coming has anything to do with Jesus resurrecting. So that's my opinion. Good question, though. I mean, I appreciate the question. Also, Amir gifting out another DZ membership. Thank you so much, Amir. And Mostly Gizzard, gifting out 10 memberships. Guys, we are on the road to 1,200 memberships. We are on the road. Thank you so much, Mostly Gizzards. I really appreciate gifting out those memberships. And Adele has another question. Thank you for the super chat, Adele. Says, my soul finds rest in Doug alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. And you shall never be shaken if your foot is firmly on the rock of Doug. Doug shall not be moved, unlike the fake God of the New Testament. And Dr. Pizza, thank you so much for the super chat, says the rapid spread of Doug is proof that Doug is true. It absolutely is. No religion has ever spread as fast as Doug, ever. You can't name one. The religion of Doug has set off just like a rocket. You can't stop it. You can't stop it. It's a force of nature because it is nature, for sure. Tyler Murphy, good to see you tonight. Thank you for the 666. Hail Nero. Tyler says, I always thought Doug was named after the video game Dig Dug. Actually, we have to talk about that. Says, knowing he wasn't shattered my faith in Dougism, and I may have to deconstruct. Tyler, he was partially named after Dig Dug. So when we first brought up Doug, somebody in the comments asked, what should he be named? And I asked the comments for the name, and somebody said Doug. And I thought to myself, yes, obviously, the first thing came to my mind was because you dig for stones. You dig for rocks. They're in the ground. So Doug makes perfect sense. And then at some point, I said something about Dig Dug in that live stream, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I've mentioned Dig Dug as being a prophecy for Doug about a dozen times since then. So don't despair. Don't deconvert. Dig Dug was a rock solid prophecy about Doug, and you've gotten divine revelation on your own about Dig Dug. So don't despair. Doug is here with you. And Aaron, a member for 4 months now, I think Aaron might have been one of the first members to join. It says, what are your thoughts on Acts 9? What do you really think happened to Saul/Paul, if anything? Great question. Here's what I think. If Paul was a real person, and I think he was. If he was a real person, oh my God, excuse me. I think Paul had a real near-death experience. I think the dude fell off his damn horse. First of all, I think he already was experiencing grief from what he was doing. If he was really out there rounding up Christians and killing people, he probably had a ton of grief and a ton of remorse and felt guilty over the shit he was doing. So when he fell off his horse and bumped his head and had a near-death experience, his brain probably gave him some kind of experience that played on his deep feelings of guilt. And it happens all the time. Anything can lead to this type of a situation. And he was blinded too, which is common with head injuries. So head injury, lack of oxygen, near-death experience, it can result in a lot of weird phenomena, you know? I've mentioned this before, but like when I was a kid, and guys, don't do this, but when I was a kid, there was a game, if you could call it a game, that we used to play amongst my siblings and friends, where you would hyperventilate, and then somebody would like squeeze you, or they would push on your chest real hard, and you would pass out for like a moment or two. And it was really interesting because people would report having visions for that moment that they passed out, and sometimes they were pretty strong. I actually had a sister, who I won't name, who after one time, I'll never forget it, she quit playing with us. She said, "Nope, not again, not for me." And we're like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, last time it happened, I saw some really crazy shit, and I don't want to do it again. It scared me. I'm not going to do it anymore." I was like, "Oh, okay then." Like, it's not real, right? This is dream. But for her, it was real. Whatever she experienced during that split moment when her brain lost oxygen, it was real enough for her that she's like, "I'm not going to do that shit again." So yeah. Did Paul fall off his horse, have a near-death experience, and change his entire life? Shit, probably. I believe it. Happens all the time. Yeah, Taco Joe says we did the hyperventilating game as well. Had all sorts of crazy visions. Yep. It's true. That's why kids are doing it, because you lose oxygen to the brain, your brain goes crazy. It mimics the experience that you would have on like whatever CO2 or DMT, not CO2, I mean DMT, or different things like that. Flanker 420, thank you so much for the $10 super chat, says, "What did the sacrifice of Jesus do? You still need to be saved and believe and repent for your sins, right? What actually did the sacrifice do to save us from sin if we still have sin? Am I crazy?" You're not crazy. In fact, I've debated people on this particular issue on live stream a lot. So, according to the Old Testament, if you just read the Old Testament, all you had to do to get forgiven is ask for forgiveness. In fact, before Jesus died, Jesus forgave a lot of people just because they repented. John was baptizing people for the remission and the forgiveness of sins. So like sins were being forgiven without people giving sacrifices. In fact, David himself in one of his prayers says that, "Let my prayer be an offering of incense for you, and let my meditations be a burnt offering," something of that nature. And in Chronicles and Chronicles, when Kings, when the temple is dedicated, Solomon prays during that whole situation, during the dedication, and basically talks for God and says, when my people will turn away, from me and rebel, if they turn to me and repent, I will hear their prayer, I will forgive them, and I will heal their land. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, 2 Samuel chapter 12, when David is confronted with his sin with Bathsheba, he confesses it to Nathan, and Nathan says, "The Lord has already put away your sin." So there's this idea that just repenting in the Old Testament is really all you need to get your sin forgiven. So Jesus comes along and is like, what the fuck did this why do we need Jesus if we can just repent and get our sins forgiven? Here's the crazier thing. The New Testament has to double down. The New Testament has to double down on this and say, well, God's going to, even if you are repentant of your sin, every time you sin, you're still full of sin. You have to continuously offer the blood of animals according to the book of Hebrews, right? And so Jesus fixes this, so you don't have to continually offer the blood. One is all you need, then you're always covered for all your sins. That way, you can go to heaven, because there's this idea that if you have unforgiven sin, you can't go to heaven. But that's not in the Old Testament. This idea, you're not crazy, Flanker. This idea that like God is just going to send everybody to hell because they're sinful creatures and they're imperfect. That shit doesn't exist in the Old Testament anywhere. That's made up. You get a little flavor of that in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Apocrypha, but even there, it doesn't really seem to appear. And in the Talmudic writings, they suggest that hell is only reserved for the most wicked people, and even for them, a maximum of 12 months. And in all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only people who go to hell are the people that were like irredeemably wicked, not just people that were imperfect. In order to keep people in the cult of Christianity, they had to come up with a theology that made it so that everybody needed Jesus. And the only way to do that is to say, well, listen, without Jesus, everybody goes to hell. That's crazy. That's crazy. Doesn't make any sense. God never in the Old Testament was sending everybody to hell for simply being imperfect. It's completely made up. Jesus died for nothing. If you can pray to God and have your sins forgiven at any point in time, then Jesus' sacrifice is completely useless. In fact, Paul even says this in Galatians chapter 2, I think it's 2:16 maybe. In Galatians chapter 2, verse, I want to say 12 or 16, I forget which one. Yeah, verse 16, I think he says. We know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through the faith of Jesus Christ. And we have come to believe in Jesus Christ so that we might be justified by faith, not by doing the works of the law, because no one will be justified by the works of the law. But if in our effort to be justified by Christ, we ourselves have been found, hold on, it wasn't, did I go too far? Blah, 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 blah. Maybe it wasn't 12. Oh, where the fuck was it? It was in Galatians chapter 2. Now I got him. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. In Galatians chapter 2, what he says is that if we are made righteous through the law, then Christ is of no use. Let me see if I can find that. Where did he say that? Shit, now I might have to Google it. I know it's in Galatians chapter 2. I'll just have to Google it. Let's see. Yeah. $2.21. How did I not see that in 2:21? Last verse. It says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. There it is. I was thinking 12. It was 21. My old man brain is failing me sometimes, guys. Or maybe I've had too long of a day. 2:21, he says that if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. And I agree. Christ did die for nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a damn thing. Anyways, Bernie, thank you so much for the super chat. Big W, it says, my Catholic brother-in-law dismisses Bible talk, prioritizing canon law. How much authority does Scripture actually have in Catholic doctrine compared to canon law? I'd also imagine canon law comes from Scripture. Okay, so Bernie, you're 100% correct. And the way the church works, the Catholic Church, is that they put the teachings of the Bible and the teaching of the church on the same level, right? So the tradition and the Bible are both here. It's not one or the other, right? So the teaching tradition cannot contradict the Bible, and the Bible cannot contradict the teaching tradition. They go hand in hand. Now, they would say that whatever is taught by the church about the Bible is authoritative. So you have to accept that. But they wouldn't accept a contradiction between the Bible and the actual text. Now, if you want to get more familiar with how the early church was interpreting the Bible, you may want to get yourself a copy of the Catechism. You may also want to get yourself a copy of this study Bible. Hold on. So this is the Didache Study Bible. And you don't have to get the green one. This is the Ignatius version with the hardcover, because I like hardcovers, guys. I don't know what to tell you. I'm rock hard for Doug, so I like my books to be rock hard. But so in this particular edition, though, what they do is they have all the passages in the Bible tied to actual church council rulings, catechism sections, and authoritative teachings from the church, so you can see what the authoritative teaching of the church actually is. So if you're reading this Bible and you're like, listen, I wonder what the official ruling of the church says about a particular passage in the Bible, this is a wonderful place to start. Now, you can also get, go online and find all the rulings of the magisterium. You can do that. That can be hard to pick through. This, I think, is your best tool, though, for if you're arguing with a Catholic and you're like, well, let me tell you what the church actually says. Because a lot of times you're going to bring up something in the Bible, and guess what? There's a lot of authorities in the Catholic Church that just ignored it. They didn't even address it. So you can bring up this problem in the Bible and you're like, listen, it doesn't matter what the church says, because the church ignored this problem. They didn't write about it. They didn't make a ruling about it. So now we get to examine this text and just look at it for what it says. And you can't tell me anything, or you can't tell me that I'm not allowed to read the Bible and apply, a logical mindset to what it says, because I'm not ignoring the church teaching. There's no church teaching on this. So hopefully that helps. That's a really good question, though. And Steve, thank you for the super chat, says, atheists not using any preferences. What in the Bible is immoral? Steve, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's crazy to me that you send in these like lowball super chats thinking that you're saying something profound. Again, atheists don't believe in objective morality. You're making a category error. You're saying what in the Bible is objectively immoral. That's what you're implying. We don't believe, at least I don't believe, in objective morals. You're asking a stupid question. Anything that I say I think is immoral is inherently going to be subjective, which is why when I have moral debates with believers, I don't tell them what I think is immoral. What I ask them is for them to tell me what they think is immoral, and then we publicly shame them using the powers of subjective morality, because shame is a powerful tool. When you want to shame somebody because they think owning slaves was okay, shame's a good way to help them see that, from our current vantage point, using subjective morality, it doesn't seem that we've come to the right conclusion on that particular topic. But Johanna Vanderklee, thank you so much for the 25,000 CRC. I have no idea what that is, but I really appreciate the super chat. I don't know what a CRC is. Guys, you have to educate me on this one. But it says, here's my take on the first three of the 10 Commandments. I am the only God. That means you personally are the only God. Don't make images of God. Hard to do when all of us are gods. Hard to do when all of us are gods. Observe the Sabbath. Be kind to yourself and take a day off. You're not too far off. And here's the crazy thing, though, is the beginning of the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, I think Exodus 34 is the two tellings of the commandments, doesn't really necessarily say that there's only one God. He says that you should put no gods before me, implicitly meaning there are other gods. And in fact, if you go to Exodus chapter 12, listen to what God says in Exodus chapter 12, when he talks about sending the plagues as judgment on Egypt. What he actually says is that he's judging the gods of Egypt. It's in Exodus 12:12, I believe. Let me put it up. It says, I will pass through the land of Egypt by night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human to animal, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Everywhere we see gods mentioned in the Old Testament seems to be that it's implying that they do actually exist. They're just punk-ass bitches compared to Yahweh. You know what I mean? So this is why most scholars agree that the Old Testament is probably more in line with henotheism, not so much monotheistic. But a good book on this particular topic, I would recommend a book by Mark S. Smith. I believe it's The Origins of Biblical Monotheism. Let me make sure I get that right. Marcus Smith, though, is an amazing, amazing scholar. I would recommend all of his books, but this is among one of my favorites. He wrote a book called The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, Israel's Polytheistic Background, and the Ugaritic Texts. So if you want to know about the Canaanite literature that came from the earliest Israelites, because the Israelites were, in fact, Canaanites, this is a good book to start with. Get The Origins of Biblical Monotheism by Mark S. Smith. And then while you're at it, get all of his other books. They're all amazing. In fact, I would also recommend Where the Gods Are. He writes a book similar to what you might get from Richard J. Clifford called Where the Gods Are, and it's how the ancient mind perceived the home of the gods. It's amazing. You're going to love it. Keegan, thank you for the super chat. Hello to the Great White North. He says, people defend weird Old Testament stuff, but ignore Ezekiel's literal poop bread. I know. The dung bread. He says, low key, why does no one talk about it? Make it make sense. Okay, so some people do talk about it. It's kind of been overdone. It's kind of like for a long time, a hot topic was to talk about how Ezekiel mentions the genitals like stallions and the emission like donkeys. So there's a couple passages of the Bible that did get a lot of airtime at one point, and now it's kind of like, I don't know. It's old news for a while. It'll come back around. Its popularity will bounce back around. But yeah, some of the crazy stuff that was happening to Ezekiel, like laying on one side for all that time, and then laying on his other side, and then cooking bread over dung. These are all symbolic actions, prophetic symbologies that probably meant a lot to Ezekiel at the time period. But in the modern context, you're like, well, that's some crazy shit. Not only that, cooking your bread over dung seems to be like it's inducing toxins. Your body is getting rid of that waste material for a reason. So I would say cooking your dung over waste, or cooking your food over waste material, is probably a good way to make your prophet sick. Kay, welcome into the live stream. Thank you for the super chat. It says, why do Christians, Charlie Kirk, bring up the Bible not condoning kidnapping as a defense for slavery? Good question. Because it's all they fucking got. They got nothing. They have no good defense for slavery. And so what they'll say is, well, yes, the Bible says you can own all these slaves, but it also says you can't kidnap people. Therefore, it nullifies slavery. But this is a dumb argument. This is a stupid argument. Because it basically allows them to not have to talk about the passages that clearly condone slavery and making slaves of children born in your household to other slaves who are clearly slaves, even though they weren't kidnapped. What they're attempting to do is to suggest that the only way you become a legitimate slave is if you're kidnapped. And kidnapping was forbidden. Therefore, slavery is forbidden. But it's a bullshit hermeneutic. And if you just go to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and Numbers 31, clearly they were kidnapping people. God allowed them to kidnap people. What we have in Exodus 21:16 is a prohibition against kidnapping free Hebrews. In fact, if you go to the parallel passage in Deuteronomy, it explicitly says kidnapping Hebrews. So this is not just about general kidnapping, because then God would be contradicting himself. This is about kidnapping free Hebrews. You're allowed to kidnap people all the time. God tells you who to kidnap, when to kidnap them, and what to do with them. So, but that's why they bring it up, because they have nothing else. They have no good rational thought patterns to defend slavery. Rock hard for Doug again. Holy shit. Rock hard says, is it possible that Jesus is the only book? Oh, sorry, James. that James is the only book in the New Testament that is part of the OD, original disciples. Everything else seems Pauline, with believe and be saved, verse you actually got to put in the work. So if you're looking at the thematic nature of James, you could make that argument for sure. But there's a lot of good reasons why James seems to be a reaction to the Pauline literature. In fact, we read a snippet of James chapter 2 earlier, where James is saying he's specifically responding to and quoting from the Apostle Paul. So it seems to me that James is who's ever writing James is coming after Paul, because he's responding to Paul's stuff, which means I think it's less likely that it's James, the brother of Jesus. Because at the time period, I guess he could be, 60-something years old writing this letter. I don't know. Possibly. He could be 70 years old writing the letter. We don't really know. But it seems that James didn't live into his old age, because we have got a lot of stories about his martyrdom being pretty early in the tradition. So that's why a lot of scholars think James didn't write James. James is a later person who is coming against the teachings of Paul. Now, that being said, whoever James is, whoever wrote the book of James, I think is more close to the teachings of Jesus. They came from the same community that taught the Jesus of the Gospels, not the Jesus of Paul. The Jesus of Paul is different from the Jesus of the Gospels, hands down. That's all there is to it. That's why Luke, the dating of Luke keeps getting pushed back further and further, because the Jesus of Luke doesn't even match the Jesus of Mark and Matthew. The Jesus of Matthew was a Judaizer. The Jesus of Luke seems to have softened that a little bit. Although in Luke chapter 16, verse 17, he seems to be Judaizing again. But anyways, I digress. So hopefully that answers your question. But guys, just go to the dating of the book of James in like a good study reference, like a good commentary. And like even in like the New Oxford Annotated Studying Bible, if you go to the book of James, give me a second, and go to the authorship section, it's got some things to say on the dating of James, actually. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. It says, this letter takes its name from the authority associated with James. So they're suggesting James didn't even write it, right? Who eventually became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So right off the bat, the Academic Study Bible is kind of suggesting that they're just playing on the authority that James was given. They don't do a ton of commenting on the authorship, but they're saying that it's probably written in the late 80s or even 90s. It says, directed to Jewish Christian congregations toward the close of the first century CE, this letter was probably written in at least two different stages. The original text may have been a sermon by James shortly before his martyrdom in the mid-60s. Then someone skilled in Hellenistic rhetoric edited, expanded, and distributed the sermon in the form of a circular letter, probably in the late 80s or 90s. It went to diasporic churches that were in disarray and needed to hear again the authoritative voice of the Jerusalem church leaders. So, and he's right. The book of James is written to the diasporic Jews, which means it was probably written after 68. Right? So, most scholars just don't believe that James was written early, which means it probably isn't written by James. Meg again with the question. Thank you so much. It says, when are you doing a Paulism debate night? I don't know. I haven't really put together notes for that. It's kind of an easy topic. I just haven't put the notes together for it. I really have to do it. I know a lot of people have asked for it. Like, a lot of people want to do the debate of like Jesus versus Paul and really pin Christians down to this nonsense of Paul contradicting Jesus. I promise I'm going to get to it eventually. I I'm sorry, I haven't got to it. One of the problems with this topic too is it's such a niche topic. I know it's going to be a small live stream too, so I want to find a way to work it into a bigger live stream, like work it into one of my main live streams, because a lot of people are going to tune out on that topic because it's just a narrow topic. But we do need to include it in our discourse. I agree. Larry Beck with a $10 super chat. Big W says another Esther joke. Oh, good. I love a good joke. Jesus can't play rugby because the ball goes through his hands. Some big holes in his hands. Jesus can't play rugby, an Aussie drinking song. I know we talked about this earlier, Larry. I did finally look up the song earlier, but I haven't listened to it yet. Unfortunately, I had to get ready for the Atheist Experience live stream shortly after the Unapologetic live stream, so I didn't get a chance to listen to it, but I'm going to listen to it tonight before I go to bed. As soon as I end this live stream, I'm going to listen to it. So thank you for the reference, Larry. And Sansabark says, do you ever wish that the infancy gospel of Thomas was included in the Bible? You'd have some wild debates with people defending Jesus unaliving fellow children. Yeah, holy shit. And bringing birds back to life and things like that. Here's the thing. I think parts of the Gospel of Thomas are authentic. I think they're just as old as any other part of the Gospels. I would prefer them to be in the Gospels. I'm sad that they're not in the Gospels. I agree with you. I think it would be funner for us if they were included. Absolutely. And Larry, again with a question. Thank you for the 666. Hail Nero. This is another one. Jesus can't play rugby because he wears illegal spikes. Oh, shit. That is a good one. Yes, Jesus has illegal spikes. Hands down. It reminds me of the joke where Jesus went to the hotel. He went to the inn. It says, I don't have any money. And he slams some nails on the counter. He says, but can you put me up for the night anyways? Classic. Rory, thank you for the super chat, says, were Adam and Eve considered first of all humankind or first Hebrews? Well, they weren't first Hebrews. We'll get to that. Which were created in their God's image and considered human with other goyim. Okay. Interesting thought. Oh, excuse me. I don't think so. I think here's why. Because the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, makes an argument that the seed of mankind, all of the seed of everybody who came from the line of Abraham was already in Abraham. We have this idea in the Bible that all humans came from the seed of Adam, right? So if all humans came from the seed of Adam, then it must mean that there were no other humans created. But it's also true that Jesus' genealogy is traced all the way back to Adam. But the first Hebrew seems to come from the ancestor that we refer to as Eber. In fact, that's why the Hebrew language is referred to as Evrit, because it's actually a soft B. The bait is a soft B. So the Hebrew origin isn't from Adam. It's actually from a guy named from Eber in the text, and that's where we get the idea of the Hebrew people. So it's a little more complicated than that, just saying that the Hebrew people were God's people, because even though there were Hebrews that came from the line of Eber, the people who came from Abraham are technically the covenant children. So there's some nuance to it there. You could say that the Adam and Eve narrative, I don't know, that there's like some kind of metaphor here between the Goyim, the non-Hebrews and the Hebrews. I don't see it. It's a good question, though. I don't see it. I'm sure there are people who believe it, but I don't think it's a great connection there. But it's worthwhile consideration. I appreciate the question. And Grim, thank you for the 666, says, Justin, did you ever believe in Santa? Who was your favorite saint? I did. Not very long. So my parents primed me to believe in Santa, but by the time I was turning 5, even before I was 5, I had already abandoned that. And here's what happened. I didn't believe I was very skeptical that anyone was fitting down a chimney. It didn't make sense to me. And houses didn't always have chimneys. A lot of unanswered questions. And when I was 5, the year I turned 5, I had determined that I was going to prove whether or not Santa was real. And so I forced myself to stay up all night. And I said, if somebody's landing on the roof, I'm going to hear it. We don't have silent reindeers. That's ridiculous. Or I would hear somebody inside the house. So I did. I stayed up all night. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I slept the next day after opening presents and whatnot. And that was the day I confirmed to my young self that there was no Santa, because there would have been evidence and there was no evidence. And so for me, I didn't believe in Santa very long, maybe 5 years old. That's about it. Good question though. And I'm sorry, you asked, did I ever pray to a saint? Did I hear that right? Let me make sure I read that right. Shit, I lost track of where I was. There we go. Who was your favorite saint? That was a good question, Grim. Okay. So give me a second on that. So I went to a Catholic school for 12 years and we taught about the saints. But I got to be honest, even at our school, we didn't talk about the saints very much. Like, they didn't get brought up very much. But I do know this. James was considered one of the saints. And I liked St. James a ton. I also liked St. Francis of Assisi. He was really cool. St. Francis of Assisi was really into pacifism and saving the animals. In fact, he was even known for preaching to the animals in the wilderness. And he gave up a life where he could have had a lucrative life from his father. He gave all of it up to live in poverty and to preach to anyone who would listen, even the animals. So he was a really cool dude. You kind of got to like that kind of guy. But I never really prayed to the saints. To me, it didn't make sense if you could just pray to God. Jake, good to see you tonight, friend. Thank you for the 666. Guys, my buddy Jake Knapp here has a podcast. Go follow him. It's called The Exodus Brothers. And him and his brother are documenting his deconstruction out of the cult as well. But he says, biblical prophecy, 10% future prediction, 90% weird dreams and angry poetry. You're so right. And we talked about this the other night. The reason why the prophecies have to be vague, they have to be the fever dreams, they have to be so weird and mystical, is because you have to build into them a level of like, oh, well, you just didn't interpret it correctly. You know, it didn't fail. The prophecy didn't fail. You just didn't interpret it correctly. And the way to do that is to write into the prophecy the crazy methods of like masking everything, you know, with a mythological reading, right? It can't actually mean what it says, because if it doesn't come true, you know, you get called out on the stage. Noah Lyons, 8 dead babies on the ark. I love the name every time I see it. It says, every time you say second coming, I think of my date. That sounds like I'm so glad you had a really good date. That brings me joy to know. So big W for Noah for having a hell of a date. 2 helpings even. And Mostly Gizzards, again, thank you so much for the super chat. It says, Jesus holds the world record for his refractory period. Takes way too long to come again. Doug is always rock hard. That's why Jesus was so upset, by the way. Because Jesus finished, but he never actually came. He just had blue balls forever. So he was hung, but he never actually came. He's still up. He's still somewhere crying about it right now. And Andre, thank you for the super chat. It says, greetings from Brazil. Holy shit. Well, welcome to America from Brazil. It says, former Catholic married to a Presbyterian. She thinks she's already saved. I think I can have a decent life and spend time in purgatory. Isn't my position more reasonable? So, kind of. So the Catholic idea of purgatory is real. In fact, you won't find it in the Old Testament very much. The real idea of purgatory shows up in the Apocrypha. So if you want to read passages about the purgatory, you got to get a Bible that still has the Apocrypha books between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You got to do it. You got to get one. Get an NABRE. Got to get an NRSV. Got to get a Westminster. I mean, you got to get a Bible that includes the Apocrypha if you want to learn about purgatory. But there's a kind of an interesting reference to a story in the book of Hebrews. I think chapter 10 talks about righteous women and is quoting from a story in the book of Maccabees. It just happens to be that same section of Maccabees also talks about people praying for the dead, right? So the argument goes from the Catholic side, if the book of Hebrews is quoting from the book of Maccabees as though it's authoritative, and the section that it's quoting from is talking about praying for the dead, it seems to be that they've got a little bit of wiggle room there to say that purgatory is real. But that being said, the Catholic view of purgatory is way more palatable than the Protestant view of hell, where either you just believe or you burn. You know what I mean? But my Catholic church taught that just because you believed in Jesus doesn't mean that you're exempt from purgatory. You still actually have to have your sins purged. Now, not every Catholic church taught that. There were churches that taught that if you were covered by the blood of Jesus, your sins were atoned for, and purgatory was for people that weren't completely wicked, but they didn't believe in Jesus. But this is where things get muddy, because the Catholic doesn't have a good official teaching on purgatory. They don't. The teachings on purgatory are technically unofficial. And I still remember when I was a junior in high school, I was learning all about purgatory, and I had not a debate, but it was a quasi debate with a priest who was teaching our religion class this particular week, and it was like an AMA, ask anything, right? And we got into the topic of purgatory, and I made the priest admit, because at the time I just wanted him to tell us what the church actually taught. I made the priest admit to the whole class that the teaching of purgatory is not actually in the official Catholic doctrine. And this is evident, obviously, because every Catholic church, even though they believe in purgatory, they don't really know exactly what they believe about purgatory. They all have different teachings because there's not a lot of clear Catholic doctrine on who goes to purgatory, how they get there. Now, that being said, I did bring up earlier the Didache Study Bible. And there is, if you go into this, there is actually a section here where they talk about purgatory. So you can see in the study Bible what the Catholic Church does say about purgatory. And I got to tell you, it's not much. They don't have a lot to say about it. So they've got a section here about particular judgment. What is particular judgment? And then there's another section here on hell. It says, how can a loving God send souls to hell? And then you hear a little bit about hell and purgatory. There's like an article inside of the Bible, right? So what it says is, those who die having willfully and definitively rejected God and his salvific grace, often by violating his commandments in a grievous manner, and then refusing repentance, place themselves in hell, a state of eternal self-exclusion from his presence. Thus, the souls in hell are those who die stubbornly, unrepentant of mortal sin by refusing the love and mercy of God to the end. Jesus spoke often of hell as fire and darkness, where the damned will weep and gnash their teeth. Luke 13:28. The souls in hell continually suffer separation from God, even as they wallow in hatred of him. We cannot be united to God unless we freely choose to love him. We cannot love God if we sin grievously against him, our neighbor, and ourselves. And so they don't really say much about purgatory, but what they do say is that the road to hell is paved by people that are adamantly choosing to do bad sins, mortal sins, not venial sins. In Catholic tradition, you have mortal and venial sins, but to do mortal sins and to be adamantly against God and repentance. And then there's another section on who goes to heaven, so on and so forth. Anyways, long and short of it is, If you want to know about these Catholic teachings, just get yourself the Didache Study Bible. It's an amazing study Bible. I promise you. You won't regret it if you actually care about Catholic teaching. And I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to know what they're teaching. You know what I mean? Anyways, thank you for the question. I appreciate that. And Katie, thank you for the super chat, says, is St. Ignatius a prophet of Doug? Unfortunately, St. Ignatius wasn't. You said St. Ignaeus. St. Ignaeus is a prophet of Doug. I don't know if St. Ignaeus will answer your prayers, but I do know that St. Ignaeus is, in fact, rock hard for Doug, and his burden is light, as igneous rock often is. And Doc Pleroma, good to see you. Thank you for the $5 super chat. It says, thoughts on Pachamonian, Pachamonian monks hiding the Nag Hammadi text as not to get shit on by Athanasius's festal letter decrees. Okay. So what you're, if I remember correctly, what you're referring to is the fact that the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden in the deserts of Egypt. And there was, I'm not going to call it a schism, but there was a faction, fighting factions within Christianity, between Christianity proper and between the Gnostics. And so the question is, were the Nag Hammadi texts hidden in order to avoid persecution based on the festal letter decrees? And the answer to that is, I don't know. This is a very good question. In fact, I wish I had the answer to this question, but the answer to the question is I don't actually know. I don't know if anyone does know for certain. I think we can speculate. We do know for sure that there are decrees that were issued early on. We've got decrees early as Theodosius II. Theodosius II already was issuing decrees to go out and round up these types of literature and burn them. Already, book burnings in like the first generation of the official Holy Roman Empire. Book burnings right away. And not only that, they were also burning philosophy. They were ordered to burn Greek philosophical works. So, yeah, is it possible that the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden in order to get around some of these decrees to get rid of these anathemized teachings, these heretical teachings? Yeah, it is possible, but unfortunately, we don't fully know. You see what I'm saying? We just don't know. What we do know is that Gnosticism was supported in Egypt. There was a large faction in Egypt that supported it, which is why we see a lot of Coptic texts that deal with Gnosticism, but not so much proper texts from the Western Church in Latin. So anyways, hope that is helpful. I don't know if it was. Unfortunately, there are some experts in the early church that have very strong opinions on this topic. And unfortunately, my opinions are not quite as strong because this is not my area of expertise. But it was a great question nonetheless. Ken Best, thank you for the $13.99, says, why is Doug so successful as a deity? Because he dug into our souls. Amen. And because, listen, Doug is humble. Doug is just a humble earthen vessel, you know. Doug doesn't overpower anybody. Doug doesn't send anybody to hell. And Doug is always rock hard for you. Doug is always on your team. I think Doug is just, he's what's not to love about Doug? He's the perfect deity, I think. Anyways, a great question. Everlasting Gobstopper, thank you for the super chat, says, not a question. I just wanted to say I don't need an imaginary friend to know right from wrong. I know. Actually, it brings up a good point, though, because according to Genesis chapter 3, humans already know right from wrong. Genesis chapter 3 says that man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, which means we should just inherently know what good and evil is. We shouldn't need a book to tell us. But if that's the case, if we know what good and evil is, then why in the world did God have to give all these laws? It doesn't make any sense. There's too many plot holes, too many. And I Heart Dogs, thank you so much for the $10 super chat, says, I'd love to see a video on the history of the Schofield Study Bible and how it created eschatological wars. Fundamentalist eschatology gave me much of my trauma when I was growing up. So that's a good point. So here's the crazy thing. I was deep in Christianity as a young believer. I was a diehard believer. I never got into the eschatology wars. To me, it was stupid. It was a useless waste of time. It meant nothing to me. As a young Christian, I wanted to know, how can I use this religion to benefit others? Because that, to me, seemed to be the utility of Christianity, to change the world for the better. So to me, arguing about the return of Jesus was the biggest just waste of time you could ever spend. Who gives a fuck when this guy's coming back? God said to do stuff. He said, while you're waiting for me to come back, here's the shit that you got to do. And I thought, that's what we need to focus on. So I didn't spend any time on eschatology. It was a waste. That being said, I had to study eschatology in Bible college and seminary. And I think the theology that Schofield puts forward is lunacy. The eschatology that came out of the Schofield era and things like dispensationalism and things like that, just loony bin. There's a reason why they don't teach that shit in seminary and Bible college anymore. It had its day in the sun. It was okay for a while. And then scholars examined it. It got reviewed by more and more scholars. It got reviewed by Bible students. It got reviewed in the universities. Then they abandoned it. They said, no. This eschatology stuff is nonsense. There's a reason why nobody in seminary is learning the teachings of Schofield. There's a reason why nobody in seminary is learning about the theology of Tim LaHaye and Jenkins. It's because that was a fun concept when it was new, but it's done. It had to stay in the sun and it lost out. The theologies that stick around in higher education are the theologies that are better rooted in Scripture. And the eschatology of Schofield is not well rooted in Scripture. That being said, I'm not saying he was stupid. Dude was smart. Dude was way smarter than me. Schofield was a bona fide genius by every measure of genius. But he was wrong on eschatology. That's all I can say about that. I'm not saying I'm smarter than Schofield. I'm not. I am not smarter than Schofield. The dude was smart, but he was wrong on eschatology. Anyways, great question though. And I haven't read the Schofield Study Bible since I was in high school. It's been that long. But tell you what, I'll get a copy of it just for you. I'll get a copy of it and I'll make some videos pointing out some of the nonsense in it. Even like the pastor of the church that I went to for a long time as a young person got tired of the Schofield Study Bible, and he didn't even have a full seminary degree. He went to Bible college for 2 years for music ministry, and he was like, yeah, I don't think this holds up. I don't think so. But yeah, I'll get a copy of Schofield. We'll go through it. Morning Glory, thank you for the $9.99 super chat. He says, if Catholicism isn't true Christianity, how do Protestants rationalize the fact that God required an additional 1,500 years after Jesus' death for the true form of Christianity to reveal itself? And this is a good question. So the question is Catholicism true Christianity? And I think Protestants that are more in the know would say yes. Orthodoxy, Catholicism, this was Christianity. This really was Christianity. But what they would say is Christianity doesn't have only one manifestation. They would say, was the movement of Christians? Yes. Was God part of the movement? Yes. Is that the only way that Christianity can manifest? No. And they would say that Protestantism, I can't say the word Protestantism needed to happen because the church became corrupt. So it started out as God's movement, but because it came corrupt, God had to find somebody else, just like he replaced the Jews with the Christians. Once the tree no longer is willing to bear fruit, God plants another tree, right? So that's kind of the Protestant view of dealing with the Catholic Church. But that being said, after I had 12 years of Catholic schooling. I went to Bible college and seminary. My Bible college and seminary were not Catholic. After studying Catholicism in depth and Protestantism as well, here's my feeling. I think if you take the teachings of the Old Testament and the teachings of the Jewish people seriously, I think Catholicism better integrates the Old Testament into theological thinking than the Protestants do. The Old Testament does a much better job of integrating Jewish thought and Jewish ideas from the Old Testament, from the Apocrypha, from Jewish literature into their theology. I think it's a more holistic view, and it's a more thoroughly Jewish view of the world. That being said, they got a lot of shit wrong too. So, what are you going to do, right? I don't think anyone got anything right. But then again, I'm an atheist. I think everyone got it wrong. I don't think this God's real. But good question. Bruce Lindsay says, if denying Jesus sends people to hell, then maybe missionaries should stay home. Wouldn't that save more people from hell? And this is a good point that I've made a lot on the streams, because if you ask a missionary what happened to like the Native Americans, if you died the day before Christianity came to the Americas and you were a Native American, would you go to heaven or hell? They'd say, well, you went to heaven. Obviously, you can't be held accountable. You were judged. If you're a good person, you were judged on your merits. But what happened 100 years after Christianity reached the Americas and the Native Americans were preached to and they were told about Jesus, and then they rejected him? Did they go to heaven? They would say, no, I guess they went to hell. They rejected Jesus. Well, this means Jesus is useless. If you can go to heaven just merely by being a decent person, then the best thing we could do is not tell people about Jesus, because Jesus doesn't have any factual basis. It seems way easier to get people to heaven by just not telling them about Jesus, because not telling them about Jesus means that they're probably just going to be judged based on their merit. And I think most people are generally good. And the ones that aren't generally good, the ones that are assholes, shit, send them to hell anyways. We didn't want them. We didn't want them here. Why do we want them in heaven? So literally the best thing we can do for the world and for the afterlife is don't tell anybody about Jesus. We got to hide this motherfucker under a bushel basket real fast if we want things to pan out the way that they should pan out. That's my viewpoint. Great question, or great statement. Joanna says CRC is a Costa Rican colon. Oh, I didn't know that. 25,000 is roughly $50. Well, Big W, whoever, Joanna sent that. Big W, Joanna, I appreciate the super chat from, I assume you're calling in from Costa Rica. I could be wrong. But Big W, thank you for supporting the channel. I appreciate that. And thanks for letting me know. Now I know. I'm now smarter than I was before. And Not Matthew says, Jesus cheats at peekaboo. Yeah, hell yeah, he does. One thing Jesus can never do is play a game of peekaboo. That's a song by L.G. Gray. And Small Johnson says, any updates on getting on Jubilee? Not yet. Not yet. I friended somebody that might be able to help me. And I think some friends of mine that are going to be on Jubilee have been putting in good words for me. So we'll see. I'd love to get on Jubilee and cook some Christians, though. We talked earlier about me not really wanting to go out and debate people, but I think going on Jubilee would really grow the channel. I really do. It would grow the channel fast and would get a lot of eyeballs on the channel. We could change a lot of people's minds with that kind of exposure. And that's what I'm all about. I want to change people's minds. Midnight Rambler, thank you so much for the $10 super chat. Says, other than the Bible, what media, books, music played a big part in your deconstruction, if any? As a deconstruction ex-Christian of 20 years, music and literature that questioned authority helped a lot. That's a good question. I don't think music played a role for me. However, There's a surprising source of media that did, and it was, we're going to say, quasi-Christian memes. So a lot of people have seen some of these funny Christian memes floating around, like Jesus knocking on a door and he's like, "Let me in." And they're like, "Why?" He goes, "From what I'm going to do to you if you don't let me in." Like, these memes are hilarious, but like there's a really good underlying truth there, which is like, wait a minute, why the fuck do I want Jesus in my life anyways? So he doesn't do the bullshit to me that he's going to do to me if I don't let him in? That's a crazy ass reason to let Jesus in. Why is he so violent? What a psychopath, right? So like, I was so entrenched in the meme world. I had like 5 meme apps on my phone. I loved memes. Memes to me, because I'm a visual learner too. Like, so that's why I like reading hardback so much. I can read it and I'm like, I'll remember it. I'll remember where I read that shit. A lot of people are like, how does Justin memorize these Bible verses? Because I read it. I just read, and my brain is visual. If you tell me something, I'll forget it immediately. I don't remember shit that I hear. But if I can see it with my eyes, I can remember it. So to me, memes, I loved them because that's my form of communication. And I went through, I saw a lot of memes where it was funny, but the underlying truth of the meme was like, "Ah, shit, that cuts really deep." That's the bullshit right there. You're hitting a nerve. Yeah, actually, somebody in the comments pointing out the non-stamp collector. Yeah, I watched a lot of videos by the non-stamp collector. And that's a really good channel to make you think. I would say, in forms of books, my favorite books in forms of like deconstructing were not atheist books. For me, it was reading comparative literature, reading the mythology of the ancient people, going through, I've got volumes and volumes of ancient literature from the time period of the Old Testament. I paid many thousands of dollars when I was in school to get a collection of books. I've got $10,000 worth of books in my library that I used over my years of Bible college and seminary, that I was working a full-time job, putting myself through school, using that money to build my library. And so go, if you can get a copy of like the ancient Near Eastern text relating to the Old Testament, or get the 4-volume set of the context of Scripture and just read these texts. What you'll find out is that what was happening in the Bible, like these prophecies, these law codes, these clean and unclean animals, these mythologies, none of them are new. All of them, they're just robbing from stuff that already existed in the ancient Near Eastern text. Shit, there's prophecies in these ancient texts from prophets about stuff that kings are going to do, and that shit came true. I mean, they're probably written after the fact, just like the Bible, but like the idea that a prophet can just say something like this geopolitical thing is going to happen and then it happens. Bible didn't invent that shit. Prophets have been doing that for thousands of years. And we got their texts, blood magic, covering sins with the blood of bulls. The Hittites were doing that shit already. The Assyrians were doing that shit already. The scapegoat ritual from Leviticus 16, the Assyrians already did it. They already had their own damn ritual. So like, to me, reading comparative literature from the ancient world really opened up my eyes to the idea like, oh, this shit's not unique at all. In fact, the sacrificial system, Christians would say, well, God had to institute the sacrificial system of the Old Testament so that it would be like a typological framework for Jesus. Bullshit. People were already doing it. The Bible included it because that's what people already believed about their God. They thought that their God needed fed. So the Bible wrote about their God just like everybody else. Anyways, Ken P, thank you for the super chat, says, I hope you debate Jay Dyer one day. He's annoying. Well, since I haven't watched a lot of Jay Dyer, I know this. Jay Dyer's not stupid. The reason why I'll probably never debate Jay is because Jay doesn't do biblical debates. Jay debates philosophy, and I don't. Philosophy is useless. Philosophy means nothing to me. I can prove that the biblical God doesn't exist without using a single word of philosophy. I don't need any of it. All I need is the Bible. I can sit down with the Bible and show you exactly why it's not true. Jay does not debate the Bible. Jay debates philosophy and then he defers to the Orthodox Church on all biblical teachings, and he runs away from the Bible, which is what philosophy people do. Don't hold yourself accountable to the shit in the Bible if you don't have to. So he doesn't. But that being said, Jay's not stupid. I've listened to Jay debate. He's a good debater. Now, on the topic of Christian debaters, you know who's the smartest, I think, and it's not Jay. And a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this. I think the best debater on the Christian topic right now is Andrew Wilson. I'm going to tell you why he's the best debater. Not because he knows a lot. He has one tactic that nobody picks up on that allows him to steamroll the debates. He does, well, Jay Dyer does it too, but the tactic that he will do, that he's the best at, is, in fact, if you watch a debate with Andrew Wilson, half the time he won't even use an opening statement. He'll give the other guy an opening statement, and then he'll skip his opening statement and go right into the questioning and cross-examination. Well, why would you do this? Why would you do such a thing? Because his debate strategy is genius. He doesn't care about defending his position. His only goal is to listen to what you say and then find all the holes in your argument, and the whole time avoid defending your whole position. He's basically doing what pre-suppers do. Pre-suppers will do anything other than defend their position. The goal is to break your position apart and to make you look silly without defending your own position. And this is the thing that Andrew Wilson is doing, but he's doing it without presuppositional apologetics. That being said, whether you're a philobro or whether you're not a philobro, this tactic works good in the debate arena because it allows you to not have to defend your claims and not get called out for having a weak position because you never actually have to talk about your position. If you can always reframe the conversation about your opponent's position, then you never actually lose because you never actually defended your position in the first place. That's the genius of these so-called debaters, is that they've never actually defended their position. Their position, the winning the debate depends on them knocking somebody else's position down, which is why I always start with the Bible. Because guess what? If the Bible's not defensible, it doesn't matter what you think about philosophy. It doesn't matter what you think about my position. The question has to be about the Bible being true. And if the Bible's not true, then I don't give a shit about your philosophy. Your God's not real. Anyways, Ptolemy, thank you for the super chat, says, someone may already have asked this, but would you be interested in debating larger YouTubers like Inspiring Philosophy? I would like to see that. Listen, my statement on this did come out. I'll debate anybody. I don't care who it is. But my goal in doing debates is not to win the debate scene. My goal is not to be the best debater. My goal is to convince as many people as humanly possible of my position. I think debating on my platform is a good way of doing that. And the reason why I debate on my platform and not other people's platforms, because it makes people come to me. It forces people into our arena where we can actually control the narrative and not let people dodge the actual important questions, not let people use dumb philosophy arguments to avoid defending the actual position they should be defending. So this is why, like, I don't think it's great to go out and try debating everybody under the sun. I don't think it's actually all that fruitful unless you can do it on a mega platform. Like, for example, when Jordan Peterson debated Matt Dillahunty or had a discussion, that was a big platform. A lot of people saw that. And I think a lot of people were probably persuaded. But just like going on to a random YouTube page to debate some guy who has a different position than me, I don't think it moves a lot of people. I don't know if it's all that effective. I don't really know. That's why I'm not, I don't really care about it. But would I love for those people to come onto my live stream and debate me? Hell yeah. Anytime. I did agree to like a quasi debate discussion last minute with IP like 2 months ago now. It was on the Tim Pool show, and the question was whether or not America could survive without Christianity. So it was essentially Tim Pool again and IP against me. It was like a 2-on-1, which is fine. Um, I don't know how debatey it was because it was kind of a discussion. I think it's a kind of a weird debate topic because there's no real answer to it. Like you can't answer what would happen to a country if their religion went away because it's a hypothetical, and all the same dumb talking points came out. Christianity did all this good shit, and then I gave all the opposing talking points. I said, okay, well here's all the bullshit that Christianity does that's not good. So it was just a typical talking points you would expect to hear in that typical debate. We didn't actually get to talk about whether or not Christianity was true. In fact, in the middle of our discussion, IP reiterated that to me. In the middle of it, he goes, "We're not debating if Christianity is true." I was like, I wasn't attempting to, which told me he was kind of butthurt. He wanted to avoid that topic at all costs. But if I was going to debate somebody on Christianity, like a big name, my concern for the debate is I could give a fuck if it has utilitarian purpose. I want to know if it's true. And here's what I know. None of those people are going to debate me on whether or not it's true. Very few big debaters are going to do that because they know it's an indefensible position, which is why they have to go to secondary positions like, is it good? Dumb discussions like that. You know what I mean? Anyways, good question though. Zygamont, thank you for the TikTok. Says no TikTok tonight. Taylor time. Oh, Taylor time. I always forget that you're Taylor time. No, not TikTok tonight. The TikTok crowd basically only wants to debate. That's why anyone's ever there. So when I do the Q&A, I did it last time. I did it again this time. When I do the Q&A, I'm just doing it on YouTube. Q&A does really well on YouTube. TikTok really is just a debate space, at least for me. So that's why I didn't do a TikTok stream. Plus, you can't really do super chats on TikTok. And I think that is the best way to get questions through. So yeah, I didn't do a dual stream to TikTok, but I'll be live again on Wednesday night doing the debates on TikTok like usual. Good to see you good to hear from you, Taylor Tom. And Notes of Devotion. When I read it, for some reason, my mind went to another friend of the channel, Gates of Delirium, because I misread the first word. Gates of Delirium was who I was thinking, but this is from Notes of Devotion. Thank you for the $10 super chat. Also, guys, it's getting late, so stop sending super chats. I got to cut this thing off when we get through with all the super chats so I can actually get some sleep and go to work tomorrow. But Notes of Devotion says, would one of the reasons why you left the faith be you lost joy in it maybe? To be honest, as a born-again Christian who is mature in their faith, it's hard for me to understand why people deconstruct. No, not at all. I enjoyed being in Christianity to the very end. I was taken away from Christianity completely through study. I was drug away from Christianity, kicking and screaming. I wasn't having a boring time with it as well. I was in ministry. I was having a blast. I was baptizing kids in rivers. I was taking them on mission trips. I was having the time of my life. I thought it was a good time. The problem was I just knew it wasn't true. So I had to get out. It couldn't hold up to scrutiny. So for me, it was hard because I didn't have any bad experiences in the faith. Not one. I never had a bad experience in church. Not even one bad experience. Isn't that crazy? I was a Christian for 20 years, never had a bad experience in the church once. Now, unfortunately, I know a lot of people that have been hurt by the church a lot. And it breaks my heart that the church has hurt so many people. But me personally, nah, I had a great run with Christianity. I have nothing to complain about. I loved every minute of it. But at the end of the day, you have to be true to yourself. And I knew that Christianity wasn't true. And so I got out. I got out quietly. I didn't drag people with me. I didn't try to convince people that Christianity was false. I didn't do any of that. I just left. I left quietly. And then eventually, I really wanted to talk about deconstruction because I saw people talking about it. Rhett and Link, when Rhett and Link did their deconstruction video, that's what got me thinking. Also, Tim, thank you for the $3 over Cash App. Big W, I appreciate that. Rhett and Link kind of opened the door to this idea of you know what? we should be talking about deconstruction. These are like really important things to actually talk about. And so I kind of put it off and I kind of put it off. And then eventually I started a YouTube channel called Deconstruction Zone because I was like, I actually do want to talk about deconstruction. I actually do want to talk about these problems. And I made like, I don't know, 2 videos. And then I didn't make any more videos because I found Christy Burke. And I was like, oh, Christy Burke is talking about deconstruction too. And her channel was growing like crazy. I was like, how is her channel growing so fast? I just started YouTube and I was like, I want to grow fast. And then I found out, oh, it's because she's got like a gazillion followers on TikTok. And so I checked out TikTok and I was like, oh shit, you can upload like 1-minute videos. Like these are easy. I can make 1-minute videos. And I just started making short little 1-minute videos on all the bullshit from the Bible. And I got sucked into TikTok. I'd left YouTube like altogether almost immediately. I got sucked into TikTok. And then eventually, after I was on TikTok for a while, I figured out how live streaming work. I was like, oh my God, live streaming is great. You could just get up on a live stream and talk to somebody. That's what I want. That's what I want to do. And so I did my first couple of live streams, just kind of like deconstruction chat on problems with the Bible. But people kept wanting to debate me. Christians could not have a discussion. They demanded debate. So I said, fuck it. I'll debate you. I don't care. Let's go. And I think Skits and Bits was the first one that really motivated me to debate on TikTok. I saw Skits and Bits cooking people on slavery. I was like, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of topics that you can cook people with. It's not hard. The Bible's full of horrific stuff. And so I got sucked into TikTok for the longest time. And then finally, last summer, people were like, Justin, you should stream to YouTube as well. I was like, well, I got a channel. I haven't done anything with it. Let me do it. So I started dual streaming to YouTube after people showed me how. And then I started posting content there. And now, I don't know. Now I think more people follow me on are in the live stream on YouTube than TikTok nowadays. But anyways, long and short of it, that's how I got to where I'm at. I didn't have any bad experiences with the church. To me, I just wanted to talk about deconstruction, and here we are. Perfect world. Welcome to the Kraken Crew Elite. You should have a link to the cheat sheet now. And our last super chat's from Noah Lyons, 8 Dead Babies again. Big W, I appreciate that. It says, what's a good book for my Mennonite dad? Oh, that's a good question. He's only going to read a Bible to check the task off. He's only going to read a Bible to check the task off a list. One that's not obviously agnostic, but will make him ask real questions and challenges his apologetics. Okay, that's a tough one. That is a tough one. Okay, you might want to go with something that opens the door to the difficulties of the Bible, but doesn't openly challenge him. There's a couple books you can get that are they're apologetic in nature, but they do open the door to some of the problems. Like, Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan? It's a good book. It's going to touch on a lot of these issues of like Numbers 31, genocide, rape, different things like that. It's going to do it from an apologetic position. The apologetics aren't good, by the way. They're not good apologetics, but it's going to open the door to those issues. So Is God a Moral Monster is one way to get them into the arena of like, here's some of the bullshit in the Bible. If you want something hard hitting, one of my favorite books is the Encyclopedia of Biblical Errancy. This is the opposite of that. This is going to show you a lot of shit wrong with the Bible and tell you that this is a problem. Now, here's what I would do, though. If you really want to introduce somebody to the Bible and you want to do it from an academic standpoint, maybe inconspicuously, but you want them to know like the scholarly opinions, and you want them to get familiar with why these problems exist, is get them a really good academic single volume commentary. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So there are a number of horrific commentaries on the market that are just bullshit, stupid, written by some pastor or written by some idiot like Dennis Prager. Don't get any of that horseshit. Don't buy any of those garbage commentaries. Don't waste a single dime on like the Clark commentary from the 1700s. There's a waste. Start out small and get a good academic commentary. And here's two of my favorites. Now, this is the Jerome Bible commentary for the 20th first century. He might not like this because this is a Catholic commentary, but this is put together by amazing scholars. This is the third edition. I'm going to say this, though. The third edition's good. It's got a lot of material here. And it's very concise notations on the Bible. My complaint with this is only one, and that is that the pages are so thin that they can be hard to read because you see the text on the other side. Other than that, it's an amazing commentary. I've got the second edition of this. It looks like this. The second edition is about the same thickness, but very thick and hardy pages, much better. And the notes between these two are roughly equivalent. There's not much difference in the notes. So get either one of these volumes. If he's a guy that likes to highlight in his books, likes to write in them, get the second edition. If he wants to read it, he's not going to mark it up, get the third edition. It's got the most information. That being said, if he's Mennonite, he might shy away from wanting to get into a Catholic commentary. I don't blame him. The Catholics didn't do good things to the Anabaptists. They were outright murdering the Anabaptists. My second recommendation for a single volume commentary would be the Oxford Bible Commentary. And this is an amazing Bible commentary. If you like the Bible commentary in the New Oxford Annotated Bible, although this is not what it looks like, I had some scrap leather and made a cover for mine because my cover wore off. It was just a paperback and it got destroyed. But get yourself a New Oxford Annotated Study Bible and just have them read the notes in that as a starting point. If you need something more substantial, get the Oxford Bible Commentary. This one is an amazing, concise commentary series. And there's more than one edition. I don't think this is actually the latest edition, if I remember correctly. I think there's one more edition that is newer, but it's going to be fine. They're going to be amazing commentaries either way. Let me see when this one was actually published. This one was published in 2001, so I'm very confident that there's a newer one out there. But the Oxford Bible Commentary is amazing. It's put together by academics from all kinds of fields. And so here's what you should do. The best way to help somebody deconstruct from the Bible is get them away from the dogmatic interpretations that they learned in church. Get them away from dogmatic interpretations that they learned because some guy within their faith tradition believed it and is teaching it, like Mino Simons, right? Get them away from Darbyite teaching. Get them away from these teachings that they only believe it because it's part of their tradition, and get them into some academic teachings about the Bible where, like, the Oxford Annotated Study Bible is like, if you go to a seminary, they're going to tell you to get this study Bible unless they're Reformed. If they're Reformed, they'll say something stupid like get the ESV study Bible. Don't do that. But that being said, once you start getting a hold of the scholarly literature, the problems start to become apparent. For example, if you're just reading the prophecy of the virgin birth in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, well, guess what? A scholarly commentary is going to tell you what it actually means in the original context. And then you, as the reader, need to sit down and wrestle with, oh shit, yeah, that's true. The original context of this prophecy has nothing to do with Jesus. Now what the fuck do I do, right? So the academic commentaries, they're telling you what it's about, and they're not trying to preserve dogma. They're not trying to salvage any teaching. So to me, I think that's a really good start to get him on the road to deconstruction is not trying to get him to deconstruct openly, but introducing him to an academic viewpoint that is trustworthy, that he could say, yeah, I should be able to trust this person. He's got a PhD. She's got a PhD. It's in a reputable Bible commentary. And I think that's a good introduction to deconstruction. That's what I think. I know that's a long answer. I hope any of that was helpful. Last reading, Carlos Valdez, thank you for gifting out 5 Deconstruction Zone memberships. I really appreciate that. I really do. And with that, guys, that's it for the night. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and doing the Q&A. I really enjoy doing Q&As. I don't do them often enough. I apologize that I probably should be doing them more rather than just debating, because a lot of times people have questions, and I'd love to answer. Oh, he's KJV only? Oh shit. Okay. Noah, if your father's KJV only, get him a book. I can't believe I'm recommending this book. Okay. There's a guy who used to run a ministry called Alpha and Omega Ministries. I don't know what he calls it anymore. But anyways, is James White. So James White, even though he's Reformed, he's a Christian, and I don't believe with 99% of what he says, he wrote a book a long time ago called The King James Only Controversy. I'll put it on the screen. It looks like this nowadays. He's had it out for a long time. But, so, here's the deal. James White and I, when I was a Christian, he doesn't know me. He doesn't know that I know him. But James White and I spent a huge amount of our time in ministry fighting against the King James Only movement. I've wrote countless articles on the folly of the King James Only movement, and I've debated so many people online and in real life on the King James Only issue. I think that's a good book to start with on the King James Only issue. It's openly hostile to King James Onlyism, so he might not like it. He might not even read it, but it's a good book to start with. I'll start adding my list of King James errors to the deconstruction spreadsheet. I'm sorry I haven't done it yet. It's kind of a no-brainer to put it in there. I'll add a tab for it. There's a lot of very, very clear translation issues with the King James Only position and the King James Bible. The one I pick on the most is I'll take a Christian to a passage that talks about Asherah in the Bible, the goddess Asherah, and then I'll ask them, go to your King James Bible and find me anywhere where Asherah shows up, and they won't be able to do it. And the reason why was in 1611, they had no idea who Asherah was, and they didn't know what to do with that Hebrew word. The root Asherah in the Hebrew tongue looks a lot like the word for tree or for wood. So they translated Asherah various ways, calling her a grove of trees, calling her a wooden pole, all kinds of stuff. They didn't know. They had no idea. And then guess what? We discovered many tablets from the ancient Near East. We discovered the Ugaritic tablets from the land of Canaan that talks ubiquitously about Asherah. And then we're like, oh, Asherah is a goddess. Oh, we didn't know that. But she doesn't show up in the King James Bible because they didn't know. They had no idea, right? So we know more than they did in 1611. We know more about the language, and we know more about the culture. We have more manuscripts to translate from, and you can show them blatant instances of them purposely inserting stuff into the text that wasn't there. For example, there's a section that talks about there's a law saying that there will not be any sodomites at the temple alongside of the temple shrine prostitutes. Well, guess what? It doesn't say that in the Hebrew text. It says there will be no female temple prostitutes and there will be no male temple prostitutes. But rather than translating the Kodashim and the Kodashah, rather than translating that as male and female temple prostitutes, it translated one as female temple prostitutes and the other as sodomites. They wanted purposely for you to think that a male temple prostitute was just a gay person, just a sodomite. That was a translation thing that they decided to put in there. It's not in there. The original text does not say sodomite. They added that in there. So there's instances of that as well in the text. There's a bunch of other nonsense too that ends up in there, because a lot of what they were doing was just copying from the Bishop's Bible. If you look at the translation notes, the rules that were given to the translators, they were told, try not to deviate from the Bishop's Bible. That was the Bible that came before it that they were replacing, and says only deviate from the reading from the Bishop's Bible if it's absolutely necessary, based on the manuscript evidence that we have. And so they did. You know what I mean? And the King James Bible also kept in Isaiah 14, verse 12, when it talks about Lucifer. Lucifer is not in the Hebrew text. Lucifer is a Latin translation of Hillel. When you translated the Hebrew into English, you should not have included Lucifer. They purposely did that because they wanted people to think that Isaiah 14 was about Satan when it's not, because it was already part of the tradition. It was built into the tradition. So, and they also included Easter in Acts. The book of Acts talks about Easter. Easter didn't exist yet. So anyways, that's my gripes about the King James only. And we've got a Jay Dyer fanboy in the house. Says, every day I'm struggling. I believe you are. And because you follow Jay Dyer. It says, Jay Dyer, I think you mean debate Jay Dyer if you're so confident. Again, I'll debate Jay Dyer any day. You get him into my live stream and I'll cook him on the Bible any day of the week, but he's not going to do it. Jay Dyer will never agree to a debate with me because we don't debate the same topic. I already told you this. Jay Dyer debates philosophy. He's a precept bro. He doesn't debate Bible. I debate Bible. We have two different categories. We don't debate the same topic. You're never going to get your wish to see your debate daddy cook me. It's not going to happen unless Jay agrees to debate the Bible, because debating philosophy is useless. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to call it a night. It's about 11:30. We're going to be live again on Wednesday. So we'll see you again on Wednesday. We'll be doing the typical debates. Thank you so much for all the questions and all the likes and shares and supports and all the super chats. I really appreciate you supporting. And remember to join the Discord. For those deconstructing that want to interact offline, join the Discord. It's in my link tree. It's in my YouTube profile. So we'd love to see you in the Discord. It grows bigger and bigger every week. We're almost at 3,000 members, and we've got an active base in there. About any given time of the day, we have about 10% of our members online. I think that's a pretty good ratio.